Chapter 18 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 18, Undine. "It's almost as good as new," cried Araminta gleefully. She was clad in a somber calico Mother Hubbard of Miss Mehitable's painstaking manufacture, and hopping back and forth on the bare floor of her room at Miss Evelina's.
"Yes," answered Dr. Ralph, "I think it's quite as good as new."
He was filled with professional pride at the satisfactory outcome of his first case, and yet was not at all pleased with the idea of Araminta's returning to Miss Mehitable's, as, perforce, she soon must do.
"Don't walk any more just now," he said. "Come here and sit down. I want to talk to you."
Araminta obeyed him unquestioningly. He settled her comfortably in the haircloth easy-chair and drew his own chair closer. There was a pause, then she looked up at him, smiling with childish wistfulness.
"Are you sorry it's well?" he asked.
I think I am," she answered shyly, the deep crimson dyeing her face.
"I can't see you any more, you know,"
said Ralph, watching her intently. The sweet face saddened in an instant, and Araminta tapped her foot restlessly upon the floor. "Perhaps," she returned slowly, "Aunt Hitty will be taken sick. Oh, I do hope she will."
"You miserable little sinner," laughed Ralph. "Do you suppose for a moment that Aunt Hitty would send for me if she were ill? Why, I believe she'd die first."
"Maybe Mr. Thorpe might be taken sick," suggested Araminta hopefully. "He's old, and sometimes I think he isn't very strong."
"He'd insist on having my father. You know, they're old friends."
"Mr. Thorpe is old, and your father is old," corrected Araminta precisely, "but they haven't been friends long. Aunt Hitty says you must always say what you mean."
"That is what I meant. Each is old, and both are friends. See?"
"It must be nice to be men," sighed Araminta, "and have friends. I have never had anybody but Aunt Hitty, and you," she added in a lower tone.
"No money, no friends, nothing but relatives," quoted Ralph cynically. "It's hard lines, little maid, hard lines."
He walked back and forth across the small room, his hands clasped behind his back, a favorite attitude Araminta had noted during the month of her illness. He pictured his probable reception should he venture to call upon her. Personally, as it was, he stood none too high in the favor of the dragon, as he was wont to term Miss Mehitable in his unflattering thoughts. Moreover, he was a man, which counted heavily against him. Since he had taken up his father's practice, he had heard a great deal about Miss Mehitable's view of marriage, and her determination to shield Araminta from such an unhappy fate. And Araminta had not been intended by Dame Nature for such shielding. Every line of her body, rounding into womanhood, defied Aunt Hitty's well-meant efforts. The soft curve of her cheek, the dimples that lurked unsuspected in the corners of her mouth, the grave, sweet eyes, all these marked Araminta for love. She had, too, a wistful, appealing childishness.
"Did you like the storybook?"
asked Ralph. "Oh, so much."
"I thought you would. What part of it did you like best?"
"It was all lovely," replied Araminta thoughtfully, "but I think the best part of it was when she went back to him after she had made him go away. It made him so glad to know that they were to talk together again." Ralph looked keenly at Araminta. The love of man and woman was so evidently outside her ken. The sleeping princess in the tower had been no more set apart. But, as he remembered, the sleeping princess had been wakened by a kiss when the right man came. A lump came into his throat, and he swallowed hard. Blindly he went over to her chair. The girl's flower-like face was lifted questioningly to his. He bent over and kissed her, full upon the lips. Araminta shrank from him a little, and the color surged into her face, but her eyes, still trustful, still tender, never wavered from his.
"I suppose I'm a brute," Ralph said huskily, "but God knows I haven't meant to be."
Araminta smiled, a sweet, uncomprehending smile. Ralph possessed himself of her hand. It was warm and steady. His own was cold and tremulous.
"Child," he said, "did anyone ever kiss you before?"
"No," replied Araminta, "only Aunt Hitty. It was when I was a baby, and she thought I was lost. She kissed me. Here." Araminta pointed to her soft cheek. "Did you kiss me because I was well?" Ralph shook his head despairingly. "The man in the book kissed the lady," went on Araminta happily, "because he was so glad they were to talk together again. But why, I shall never see you any more," she concluded sadly. His fingers tightened upon hers.
"Yes," he said in a strange voice, "we shall see each other again."
"They both seem very well," sighed Araminta, referring to Aunt Hitty and Mr. Thorpe. "And even if I fell off a ladder again, it might not hurt me at all. I have fallen from lots of places and only get black and blue. I never broke before."
"Listen, child," said Ralph, "would you rather live with Aunt Hitty or with me?"
"Why, Dr. Ralph, of course I'd rather live with you, but Aunt Hitty would never let me."
"We're not talking about Aunt Hitty now. Is there anyone in the world whom you like better than you do me?"
"No," said Araminta softly, her eyes shining. "How could there be?"
"Do you love me, Araminta?"
"Yes," she answered sweetly. "Of course I do. You've been so good to me."
The tone made the words meaningless. "Child," said Ralph, "you break my heart."
He walked back and forth again restlessly, and Araminta watched him, vaguely troubled. What in the world had she done? Meanwhile he was meditating. He could not bear to have her go back to her prison, even for a little while. Had he found her only to lose her because she had no soul? Presently he came back to her and stood by her chair. "Listen, dear," he said tenderly. "You told me there was no one in the world for whom you cared more than you care for me. You said you loved me, and I love you. God knows I do. If you'll trust me, Araminta, you'll never be sorry, never for one single minute, as long as you live. Would you like to live with me in a little house with roses climbing over it, just us two alone?" "Yes," returned Araminta dreamily, "and I could keep the little cat."
"You can have 1,000,000 cats if you like, but all I want is you, just you, sweetheart, to love me with all the love you can give me. Will you come?"
"Oh," cried Araminta, "if Aunt Hitty would only let me, but she never would."
"We won't ask her," returned Ralph. "We'll go away tonight and be married."
At the word, Araminta started out of her chair. Her face was white and her eyes wide with fear. "I couldn't," she said with difficulty. "You shouldn't ask me to do what you know is wrong. Just because my mother was married, because she was wicked, you must not think that I would be wicked too."
Hot words were struggling for utterance, but Ralph choked them back.
The fog was thick before him, and he saw Araminta as through a heavy veil.
"Undine," he said, moistening his parched lips, "some day you will find your soul, and when you do, come to me. I shall be waiting."
He went out of the room unsteadily and closed the door. He stood at the head of the stairs for a long time before he went down. Apparently there was no one in the house. He went into the parlor and sat down, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead and trying to regain his self-control. He saw clearly that Araminta was not in the least to blame, that almost ever since her birth she had been under the thumb of a domineering woman who persistently inculcated her own warped ideas. Since her earliest childhood, Araminta had been taught that marriage was wrong, that her own mother was wicked because she had been married. And of the love between man and woman, the child knew absolutely nothing.
"Good God," muttered Ralph. "My little girl, oh, my little girl."
Manlike, he loved her more than ever because she had denied him. Manlike, he wanted her now as he had never wanted her before. Through the weeks that he had seen her every day, he had grown to feel his need of her, to hunger for the sweetness of her absolute dependence upon him. Yet, until now, he had not guessed how deeply he cared, nor guessed that such caring was possible. He sat there for the better part of an hour, slowly regaining command of himself. Miss Evelina came through the hall and paused just outside the door, feeling intuitively that someone was in the house. She drew down her veil and went in.
"I thought you had gone,"
she said. "Did you wish to see me?"
"No," returned Ralph wearily. "Not especially."
She sat down opposite him, silently. All her movements were quiet, for she had never been the noisy sort of woman. There was something soothing in the veiled presence.
"I hope I'm not intruding," ventured Ralph at length. "I'll go presently. I've just had a blow. That little saint upstairs has been taught that marriage is wicked."
"I know," returned Miss Evelina, instantly comprehending.
"Mehitable has very strange ideas."
"I'm sorry," she added in a tone she might have used in speaking to Anthony Dexter years before. Her sympathy touched the right chord. It was not obtrusive, it had no hint of pity. It was simply that one who had been hurt fully understood the hurt of another. Ralph felt a mysterious kinship.
"I've wanted for some time to ask you," he began awkwardly, "if there was not something I could do for you. The veil, you know."
He stopped at a loss for further words.
"Yes?"
Miss Evelina's voice was politely inquiring. She thought it odd for Anthony Dexter's son to be concerned about her veil. She wondered whether he meditated giving her a box of chiffon as Piper Tom had done.
"Believe me," he said impetuously, "I only want to help. I want to make it possible for you to take that thing off."
"It is not possible," returned Miss Evelina after a painful interval. "I shall always wear my veil."
"You don't understand,"
explained Ralph. It seemed to him that he had spent the day telling women they did not understand.
"I know, of course, that there was some dreadful accident, and that it happened a long time ago. Since then, wonderful advances have been made in surgery. There is a great deal possible now that was not dreamed of then. Of course, I should not think of attempting it myself, but I would find the man who could do it, take you to him, and stand by you until it was over."
The clock ticked loudly, and a little bird sang outside, but there was no other sound.
"I want to help you," said Ralph humbly as he rose to his feet. "Believe me, I want to help you."
Miss Evelina said nothing, but she followed him to the door. At the threshold, Ralph turned back.
"Won't you let me help you?" he asked. "Won't you even let me try?"
"I thank you," said Miss Evelina coldly, "but nothing can be done." The door closed behind him with a portentous suggestion of finality. As he went down the path, Ralph felt himself shut out from love and from all human service. He did not look back to the upper window where Araminta was watching, her face stained with tears. As he went out of the gate, she too felt shut out from something strangely new and sweet, but her conscience rigidly approved none the less. Against Aunt Hitty's moral precepts, Araminta leaned securely, and she was sure that she had done right. The Maltese kitten was purring upon a cushion. The love storybook lay on the table near by. Dr. Ralph was going down the road, his head bowed. They would never see each other again. Never in all the world. She would not tell Aunt Hitty that Dr. Ralph had asked her to marry him. She would shield him, even though he had insulted her. She would not tell Aunt Hitty that Dr. Ralph had kissed her, as the man in the storybook had kissed the lady who came back to him. She would not tell anybody. Never in all the world, thought Araminta. We shall never see each other again. Dr. Ralph was out of sight now, and she could never watch for him any more. He had gone away forever, and she had broken his heart. For the moment Araminta straightened herself proudly, for she had been taught that it did not matter whether one's heart broke or not, one must always do what was right. And Aunt Hitty knew what was right. Suddenly she sank on her knees beside her bed, burying her face in the pillow, for her heart was breaking too. "Oh, Lord," she prayed, sobbing wildly, "keep me from the contamination of marriage, for thy sake. Amen." The door opened silently. A soft, slow step came near. The pillow was drawn away, and a cool hand was laid upon Araminta's burning cheek. "Child," said Miss Evelina, "what is wrong?" Araminta had not meant to tell, but she did. She sobbed out in disjointed fragments all the sorry tale. Wisely, Miss Evelina waited until the storm had spent itself, secretly wishing that she too might know the relief of tears. "I knew," said Miss Evelina, her cool, quiet hand still upon Araminta's face. "Dr. Ralph told me before he went home." "Oh," cried Araminta, "does he hate me?" "Hate you?" repeated Miss Evelina. "Dear child, no. He loves you. Would you believe me, Araminta, if I told you that it was not wrong to be married? That there was no reason in the world why you should not marry the man who loves you?" "Not wrong?" exclaimed Araminta incredulously. "Aunt Hitty says it is. My mother was married." "Yes," said Miss Evelina, "and so was mine. Aunt Hitty's mother was married too." "Are you sure?" demanded Araminta. "She never told me so. If her mother was married, why didn't she tell me?" "I don't know, dear," returned Miss Evelina truthfully. "Mehitable's ways are strange." Had she been asked to choose at the moment between Araminta's dense ignorance and all of her own knowledge, embracing as it did a world of pain, she would have chosen gladly the fuller life. The doorbell below rang loudly, defiantly. It was the kind of a ring which might impel the dead to answer it. Miss Evelina fairly ran downstairs. Outside stood Miss Mehitable. Unwillingly, in her wake, had come the Reverend Austin Thorpe. Under Miss Mehitable's capable and constant direction, he had made a stretcher out of the clothes poles and a sheet. He was jaded in spirit beyond all words to express, but he had come, as Roman captives come, chained to the chariot wheels of the conqueror. "Me and the minister," announced Miss Mehitable imperiously, "have come to take Minty home." End of chapter 18. Undine. Recording by Linda Bell West. Chapter 19 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Bell West. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 19. In the Shadow of the Cypress. The house seemed lonely without Araminta. Miss Evelina missed the child more than she had supposed she could ever miss anyone. She had grown to love her, and, too, she missed the work. Miss Evelina's house was clean now, and most of the necessary labor had been performed by her own frail hands. The care of Araminta had been an added burden, which she had borne because it had been forced upon her. Slowly but surely she had been compelled to take thought for others. The promise of spring had come to beautiful fulfillment, and the world was all abloom. Faint mists of May were rising from the earth, and filmy clouds half veiled the moon. The loneliness of the house was unbearable, so Miss Evelina went out into the garden, her veil fluttering moth-like about her head. The old pain was still at her heart, yet in a way it was changed. She had come again into the field of service. Miss Mehitable had been kind to her, indeed more than kind. The piper had made her a garden, and she had taken care of Araminta. Dr. Ralph, meaning to be wholly kind, had offered to help her if he could, and she had been on the point of doing a small service for him when fate, in the person of Miss Mehitable, intervened. And over and above and beyond all, Anthony Dexter had come back to offer her tardy reparation. That hour was continually present with her. She could not forget his tortured face when she had thrown back her veil. What if she had taken him at his word and gone with him to be, as he said, a mother to his son? Miss Evelina laughed bitterly. The beauty of the night brought her no peace as she wandered about the garden. Without knowing it, she longed for human companionship. Piper Tom had finished his work, Dr. Ralph would come no more, Araminta had gone, and Miss Mehitable offered little comfort. She went to the gate and leaned upon it, looking down the road. Thus she had watched for Anthony Dexter in years gone by. Memories mercilessly keen returned to her. As though it were yesterday, she remembered the moonlit night of their betrothal, felt his eager arms about her, and his bearded cheek pressed close to hers. She heard again the music of his voice as he whispered passionately, "I love you, oh, I love you, for life, for death, for all eternity." The rosebush had been carefully pruned and tied up, but it promised little at best. The cypress had grown steadily, and at times its long shadow reached through the door and into the house. Heavily, too, upon her heart the shadow of the cypress lay, for sorrow seems so much deeper than joy. A figure came up the road, and she turned away, intending to go into the house. Then she perceived that it was Piper Tom, and drawing down her veil, turned back to wait for him. He had never come at night before. Even in the darkness she noted a change in him. The atmosphere of youth was all gone. He walked slowly, as though he had aged, and the red feather no longer bobbed in his hat. He walked past her silently and sat down on the steps. "Will you come in?" asked Evelina. "No," answered the piper sadly. "I'll not be coming in. It is selfish of me, perhaps, but I came to you because I had sorrow of my own." Miss Evelina sat down on the step beside him and waited for him to speak. "It is a small sorrow, perhaps, you'll be thinking," he said at last. "And not knowing what great ones you have seen face to face, but 'tis so ordered that all sorrows are not the same. 'Tis all in the heart that bears them. I told you I had known them all, and at the time I was thinking I spoke the truth. A woman never loved me, so I have lost the love of no woman, but," he went on with difficulty, "no one had ever killed my dog." "How?" asked Miss Evelina dully. It seemed a matter of small moment to her. "I'll not be paining you with that," the piper answered. "At the last 'twas I who killed him to save him from further hurt. 'Twas the best I could do for the little lad, and I'm thinking he'd take it from me rather than from anyone else. I'm missing his cheerful bark and his pleasant ways, but I've taken him away forever from Dr. Dexter and his kind." "Dr. Dexter?" Evelina sprang to her feet, her body tense and quivering. "Aye, Dr. Dexter. Not the young man, but the old one." A deep-drawn breath was her only answer, but the piper looked up, startled. Slowly he rose to his feet and leaned toward her intently, as though to see her face behind her veil. "Spinner in the shadow," he said with infinite tenderness. "I'm thinking 'twas he who hurt you, too." Evelina's head dropped. She swayed and would have fallen had he not put his arm around her. She sat down on the step again and hid her veiled face in her hands. "'Twas that, I'm thinking, that brought me to you," he went on. "I knew that you did not care much for the little lad. He was not to anyone but me. 'Tis this that binds us together, you and I." The moon climbed higher into the heavens, and the clouds were blown away. The shadow of the cypress was thrown toward them, and the dense night of it concealed the half-open door. "See," breathed Evelina, "the shadow of the cypress is long." "Aye," answered Piper Tom, "the shadow of the cypress is long, and the rose blooms but once a year. 'Tis the way of the world." He loosened his flute from the cord by which it was slung over his shoulder. "I was going to the woods," he said, "but at the last I could not, for the little lad always fared with me when I went out to play. He would sit quite still while I made the music, so still that he never frightened even the birds.
The birds came too. "'Tis a way I've had for long," he continued. "I never could be learning the printed music, so I made music of my own. So many laughed at it, not hearing any tune, that I've always played by myself. 'Twas my own soul breathing into it. Perhaps I'm not to blame that it never made a tune. Sometimes I'm thinking that there may be tunes and tunes. I was once in a place where there were many instruments all playing at once, and there was nothing come from it that one could call a tune. But 'twas great and beautiful beyond any words of mine to tell you, and the master of them all, standing up in front, knew just when each must play. Most, of course, I watched the one who played the flute, and listened to the voice of it. 'Tis strange how, if you listen, you can pick out one instrument from all the rest. I saw that sometimes he did not play at all, and yet the music went on. Sometimes, again, he was privileged to play just a note or two, not at all like a tune. 'Twas just his part, and by itself it would have sounded queer. I might have laughed at it myself if I did not know and was listening for a tune. But the master of them all was pleased because the man with the flute made his few notes to sing rightly when they should sing, and because he kept still when there was no need of his instrument. So I'm thinking," concluded the piper humbly, "that these few notes of mine may belong to something I cannot hear, and that the master himself leads me when 'tis time to play."
He put the instrument to his lips and began to play softly. The low, sweet notes were, as he said, no evident part of a tune, yet they were not without a deep and tender appeal. Evelina listened, her head still bowed. It did not sound like the pipes of Pan, but rather like some fragment of a mysterious, heart-breaking melody. Faint, far echoes rang back from the surrounding hills, as though in a distant forest cathedral another piper sat enthroned. The sound of singing waters murmured through the night as the piper's flute breathed of stream and sea. There was the rush of a summer wind through the swaying branches, the tinkle of raindrops, the deep notes of rising storm. Moonlight shimmered through it, birds sang in green silences, and there was scent of birch and pine. Then swiftly the music changed. Through the utter sadness of it came also a hint of peace, as though one had planted a garden of roses, and instead there had come up herbs and balm. In the passionate pain there was also uplifting, a flight on broken wings. Above and beyond all there was a haunting question, to which the answer seemed lost. At length the piper laid down his flute. "You do not laugh," he said, "and yet I'm thinking you may not care for music that has no tune." "I do care," returned Evelina. "I remember," he answered slowly. "It was the day in the woods when I called you, and you came." "I was hurt," she said. "I had been terribly hurt only that morning." "Yes, many have come to me so. Often when I've played in the woods the music that has no tune, someone who is very sad has come to me. I saw you that day from far, and I felt you were sad, so I called you. I called you," he repeated, lingering on the words, "and you came. I do not so much care for the printed music," he went on after an interval, "unless it might be the great beautiful music which takes so many to play. I have often thought of it, and wondered what might happen if the players were not willing to follow the master, if one should play a tune where no tune was written, and he who was the violin should insist on playing the flute. I would not want the violin, for I think the flute is best of all. It is made from the trees on the mountains, and the silver hidden within, and so is best fitted for the message of the mountains, the great high music. I'm thinking that the life we live is not unlike the players. We have each our own instrument, but we are not content to follow as the master leads. We do not like the low, long notes that mean sadness. We will not take what is meant for us, but insist on the dancing tunes and the light music of pleasure. It is this that makes the discord and all the confusion. The master knows his meaning, and could we each play our part well at the right time, there would be nothing wrong in all the world." Miss Evelina sighed deeply, and the piper put his hand on hers. "I'm not meaning to reproach you," he said kindly, "though truly I do think you have played wrong. In any music I have heard, there has never been any one instrument that has played all the time, and sadly. When there is sadness, there is always rest, and you have had no rest. No, said Evelina, her voice breaking. I have had no rest. God knows that.
Then do you not see, asked the piper very gently, that you cannot help but make the music wrong? The master gives you one deep note to play, and you hold it, always the same note, till the music is at an end. 'Tis something wrong, I'm thinking, that has made you hold it so. I'm not asking you to tell me, but I think that one day I shall see. Together we shall find out what makes the music wrong, and together we will make it right again.
Together? Repeated Evelina unconsciously. Once the word had been sweet to her, but now it brought only bitterness.
Aye, together. 'Tis for that I stayed. Letty and I were going on that very day we saw you in the wood, the day I called you, and you came. I shall see some day what has made it wrong. Yes, Spinner in the shadow, I shall see. I'm grieving now for Laddie, and my heart is sore, but when I have forgiven him, I shall be at rest.
Forgiven who? Queried Evelina.
Why, the man who hurt Laddie. The same, I'm thinking, who hurt you. But your hurt was worse than Laddie's, I take it, so 'tis harder to forgive.
Evelina's heart beat hard. Never before had she thought of forgiving Anthony Dexter. She put it aside quickly as altogether impossible. Moreover, he had not asked. What is it to forgive? She questioned curiously.
The word is not made right, answered the piper. I'm thinking 'tis wrong and too, as many things in this world are until we move and look at them from another way. It's giving for, that's all. When you have put self so wholly aside that you can be sorry for him because he has wronged you, why, then you have forgiven.
I shall never be able to do that, she returned. Why, I should not even try.
Ah, cried the piper, I knew that some day I should find out what was wrong, but I did not think it would be now. 'Tis because you have not forgiven that you have been sad for so long. When you have forgiven, you will be free.
He never asked, muttered Evelina.
No, 'tis very strange, I'm thinking. But those who most need to be forgiven are those who never ask. 'Tis hard, I know, for I cannot yet be sorry for him because he hurt Laddie. I can only be sorry for Laddie, who was hurt. But the great truth is there. When I have grown to where I can be sorry for him as well as for Laddie, why, my grieving will be done.
The little chap, mused the piper fondly.
He was a faithful comrade. 'Twas a true heart that the brute. What am I saying? I'll not be forgetting how he fared with me in sun and storm, sharing a crust with me, often as man to man, and not complaining because we were together. A woman never loved me, but a dog has, and I'm thinking that some day I may have the greater love because I've been worthy of the less. My mother died when I was born, and because of that I've tried to make the world easier for all women. I'm not thinking I have wholly failed, yet the great love has not come. I've often thought, went on Piper Tom simply, that if a woman waited for me at night when I went home with love on her face, and if a woman's hand might be in mine when the master tells me that I'm no longer needed for the music, 'twould make the leaving very easy, and I should not ask for heaven. I've seen so often the precious jewel of a woman's love cast aside by a man who did not know what he had, having blinded himself with tinsel until his true knowledge was lost. You'll forgive me for my rambling talk, I'm thinking, for I'm still grieving for the little chap, and I cannot say yet that I have forgiven.
He rose, slung his flute over his shoulder again, and went slowly toward the gate. Evelina followed him to the cypress tree.
See, he said, turning, the shadow of the cypress is long. 'Tis because you have not forgiven. I'm thinking it may be easier for us to forgive together, since it is the same man.
Yes, returned Evelina steadily. The shadow of the cypress is long, and I never shall forgive.
Aye, said the piper, we'll forgive him together, you and I. I'll help you, since your hurt is greater than mine. You have veiled your soul as you have veiled your face, but through forgiveness the beauty of the one will shine out again, and I'm thinking, through love, the other may shine out too. You have hidden your face because you are so beautiful. You have hidden your soul because you are so sad. I called you in the woods, and I call you now. I shall never cease calling until you come.
He went out of the gate and did not answer her faint "Good night." Was it true, as he said, that he should never cease calling her? Something in her spirit stirred strangely at his appeal, as a far celestial trumpet blown from on high might summon the valiant soul of a warrior who had died in the charge. End of chapter 19, In the Shadow of the Cypress.
Chapter 20. A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 20. "Father," said Ralph, pacing back and forth, as was his habit, "I have wanted for some time to ask you about Miss Evelina, the woman, you know, in the little house on the hill. She always wears a veil, and there can be no reason for it except some terrible disfigurement. Has she never consulted you?" "Never," answered Anthony Dexter, with dry lips. "I remember you told me, but it seems strange. I spoke to her about it the other day. I told her I was sure that something could be done. I offered to find the best available specialist for her, go with her, and stand by her until it was over." Anthony Dexter laughed, a harsh, unnatural laugh that jarred upon his son. "I fail to see anything particularly funny about it," remarked Ralph coldly. "What did she say?" asked his father, not daring to meet Ralph's eyes. "She thanked me and said nothing could be done." "She didn't show you her face, I take it?" "No. I should have thought she would, under the circumstances." "Under all the circumstances." "Have you seen her face?" asked Ralph quickly. "By chance or in any other way?" "Yes." "How is it? Is it so bad that nothing can be done?" "She was perfectly right," returned Anthony Dexter slowly. "There is nothing to be done." At the moment the phantom Evelina was pacing back and forth between the man and his son. Her veiled face was proudly turned away. "I wonder," thought Anthony Dexter curiously, "if she hears. If she did, though, she'd speak or throw back her veil, so she doesn't hear." "I may be wrong," sighed Ralph, "but I've always believed that nothing is so bad it can't be made better." "The unfailing earmark of youth, my son," returned Anthony Dexter patronizingly. "You'll get over that." He laughed again, gratingly, and went out, followed by his persistent apparition. "We'll go out for a walk, Evelina," he muttered, when he was halfway to the gate. "We'll see how far you can go without getting tired." The fantastic notion of wearying his veiled pursuer appealed to him strongly. Ralph watched his father uneasily. Even though he had been relieved of the greater part of his work, Anthony Dexter did not seem to be improving. He was morose, unreasonable, and given to staring vacantly into space for hours at a time. Ralph almost spoke to him when he did not hear at all, and at times he turned his head from left to right and back again slowly, but with the maddening regularity of clockwork. He ate little, but claimed to sleep well. Whatever it was seemed to be of the mind rather than the body, and Ralph could find nothing in his father's circumstances calculated to worry anyone in the slightest degree. He planned, vaguely, to invite a friend who was skilled in the diagnosis of obscure mental disorders to spend a week-end with him, a little later on, and to ask him to observe his father closely. He did not doubt but that Anthony Dexter would see quickly through so flimsy a pretense, but unless he improved, something of the kind would have to be done soon. Meanwhile his heart yearned strangely toward Miss Evelina. It was altogether possible that something might be done. Ralph was modest, but new discoveries were constantly being made, and he knew that his own knowledge was more abreast of the times than his father's could be. At any rate, he was not so easily satisfied. He was trying faithfully to forget Araminta, but was not succeeding. The sweet, childish face haunted him as constantly as the veiled phantom haunted his father, but in a different way. Through his own unhappiness he came into kinship with all the misery of the world. He longed to uplift, to help, to heal. He decided to try once more to talk with Miss Evelina, to ask her, point blank, if need be, to let him see her face. He knew that his father lacked sympathy, and he was sure that when Miss Evelina once thoroughly understood him, she would be willing to let him help her. On the way uphill he considered how he should approach the subject. He had already planned to make an ostensible errand of the book he had loaned Araminta. Perhaps Miss Evelina had read it, or would like to, and he could begin in that way to talk to her. When he reached the gate, the house seemed deserted, though the front door was ajar. It was a warm, sweet afternoon in early summer, and the world was very still, except for the winged folk of wood and field. He tapped gently at the door, but there was no answer. He went around to the back door, but it was closed, and there was no sign that the place was occupied, except quantities of white chiffon hung about the line. Being a man, Ralph did not perceive that Miss Evelina had washed every veil she possessed. He went back to the front of the house again and found that the door was still ajar. She might have gone away, though it seemed unlikely, or it was not impossible that she might have been taken suddenly ill, and was unable to come to the door. Ralph went in, softly as he had done before. Miss Evelina had frequently left the door open for him at the hour he was expected to visit his patient. He paused a moment in the hall, but heard no sound save slow, deep breathing. He turned into the parlor, but stopped on the threshold, as if he had suddenly changed to stone. Upon the couch lay Miss Evelina asleep and unveiled. Her face was turned toward him, a face of such unsurpassing beauty that he gasped in astonishment. He had never seen such wondrous perfection of line and feature, nor such a crown of splendor as her lustreless white hair, falling loosely about her shoulders. Her face was as pure and as cold as marble, flawless and singularly transparent. Her lips were deep scarlet and perfectly shaped. The white, slender columns of her throat held her head proudly. Long, dark lashes swept her cheek, and the years had left no lines. Feeling the intense scrutiny, Miss Evelina opened her eyes slowly, like one still half asleep. Her eyes were violet, so deep in color as to seem almost black. She stared at Ralph, unseeing. Then the light of recognition flashed over her face, and she sat up, reaching quickly for her missing veil. "Miss Evelina!" cried Ralph. "Why, oh, why?" "Why did you come in?" she demanded resentfully. "You had no right." "Forgive me," he pleaded, coming to her. "I've often come in when the door was open. Why, you've left it open for me yourself. Don't you know you have?" "Perhaps," she answered, a faint color coming into her cheek. "I had no idea of going to sleep. I'm sorry." "I thought you might be ill," said Ralph, excusing himself further. "Believe me, Miss Evelina, I had no thought of intruding. I only came to help you." He stood before her, still staring, and her eyes met his clearly in return. In the violet depths was a world of knowledge and pain. Suffering had transfigured her face into a noble beauty for which there were no words. Such a face might be the dream of a sculptor, the despair of a painter, and the ecstasy of a lover. "Why?" cried Ralph again. "Because," she answered simply, "my beauty was my curse." Ralph did not see that the words were melodramatic. He only sat down, weakly, in a chair opposite her. He never once took his eyes away from her, but stared at her helplessly, like a man in a dream. "Why?" he questioned again. "Tell me why?" "It was in a laboratory," explained Miss Evelina. "I was there with the man I loved and to whom I was to be married the next day. No one knew of our engagement, for in a small town, you know, people will talk, and we both felt that it was too sacred to be spoken of lightly. He was trying an experiment, and I was watching. He came to the retort to put in another chemical and leaned over it. I heard the mass seething and pushed him away with all of my strength. Instantly there was a terrible explosion. When I came to my senses again, I was in the hospital, wrapped in bandages. I had been terribly burned. See?" She loosened her black gown at the throat and pushed it down over her right shoulder. Ralph shuddered at the deep, flaming scars. "My arm is worse," she said quickly, covering her shoulder again. "I need not show you that. My face was burned too, but scarcely at all. To this day I do not know how I escaped. I must have thrown up my arm instinctively to shield my face. See, there are no scars." "I see," murmured Ralph. "And what of him?" The dark eyes gleamed indescribably. "What of him?" she asked with assumed lightness. "Why, he was not hurt at all. I saved him from disfigurement, if not from death. I bear the scars. He goes free." "I know," said Ralph, "but why were you not married? All his life and love would be little enough to give in return for that." Miss Evelina fixed her deep eyes upon Anthony Dexter's son. In her voice there was no hint of faltering. "I never saw him again," she said, "until 25 years afterward, and then I was veiled. He went away." "Went away!" repeated Ralph incredulously. "Miss Evelina, what do you mean?" "What I said," she replied. "He went away. He came once to the hospital. As it happened, there was another girl there, named Evelyn Gray, burned by acid, and infinitely worse than I. The two names became confused. He was told that I would be disfigured for life, that every feature was destroyed except my sight. That was enough for him. He asked no more questions, but simply went away." "Coward!" cried Ralph, his face white. "Cur!" Miss Evelina's eyes gleamed with subtle triumph. "What would you?" she asked unemotionally. "He told me that day of the accident that it was my soul he loved, and not my body, but at the test he failed. Men usually fail women, do they not, in anything that puts their love to the test? He went away. In a year he was married, and he has a son." "A son!" repeated Ralph. "What a heritage of disgrace for a son! Does the boy know?" There was a significant silence. "I do not think his father has told him," said Evelina, with forced calmness. "If he had," muttered Ralph, his hands clenched and his teeth set, "his son must have struck him dead where he stood. To accept that from a woman, and then to go away!" "What would you?" asked Evelina again. A curious, tigerish impulse was taking definite shape in her. "Would you have him marry her?" "Marry her? 1,000 times yes, if she would stoop so low. What man is worthy of a woman who saves his life at the risk of her own?" "Disfigured?" asked Evelina in an awed voice. "Yes," cried Ralph, "with the scars she bore for him." There was a tense, painful interval. Miss Evelina was grappling with a hideous temptation. One word from her, and she was revenged upon Anthony Dexter for all the years of suffering. One word from her, and sure payment would be made in the most subtle, terrible way. She guessed that he could not bear the condemnation of this idolized son. The old pain gnawed at her heart. Anthony Dexter had come back. She had had her little hour of triumph, and still she had not been freed. The piper had told her that only forgiveness could loosen her chains. And how could Anthony Dexter be forgiven, when even his son said that he was a coward and a cur? Miss Evelina's lips moved, then became still. "And so," said Ralph, "you have gone veiled ever since, for the sake of that beast?" "No, it was for my own sake. Do you wonder that I have done it? When I first realized what had happened in an awful night that turned my brown hair white, I knew that love and I were strangers for evermore. When I left the hospital I was obliged for a time to wear it. The new skin was tender and bright red. It broke very easily." "I know," nodded Ralph. "There were oils to be kept upon it, too, and so I wore the veil. I became accustomed to the shelter of it. I could walk the streets and see, dimly, without being seen. In those days I thought that, perhaps, I might meet him." "I don't wonder you shrank from it," returned Ralph. His voice was almost inaudible. "It became harder still to put it by. My heart was broken, and it shielded me as a long black veil shields a widow. It protected me from curious questions. Never but once or twice in all the 25 years have I been asked about it, and then I simply did not answer. People, after all, are very kind." "Were you never ill?" "Never, though every night of my life I have prayed for death. At first I clung to it without reason, except what I have told you. Then, later on, I began to see a further protection. Veiled as I was, no man would ever love me again. I should never be tempted to trust, only to be betrayed. Not that I ever could trust, you understand, but still, sometimes," concluded Miss Evelina piteously, "I think the heart of a woman is strangely hungry for love." "I understand," said Ralph, "and believe me, I do not blame you. Perhaps it was the best thing you could do. Let me ask you of the man. You said, I think, that he still lives?" "Yes." Miss Evelina's voice was very low. "He is well and happy? Prosperous?" "Yes." "Do you know where he lives?" "Yes." "Has he ever suffered at all from his cowardice, his shirking?" "How should I know?" "Then, Miss Evelina," said Ralph, his voice thick with passion and his hands tightly clenched, "will you let me go to him? For the honor of men, I should like to punish this one brute. I think I could present an argument that even he might understand." The temptation became insistent. The sheathed dagger was in Evelina's hands. She had only to draw forth the glittering steel. A vengeance more subtle than she had ever dared to dream of was hers to command. "Tell me his name," breathed Ralph. "Only tell me his name." Miss Evelina threw back her beautiful head proudly. "No," she said firmly, "I will not. Go," she cried, pointing uncertainly to the door. "For the love of God, go!" End of chapter 20. Recording by Ginger Kukalo, Washington, D.C.
Chapter 21 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 21. The Poppies Claim Their Own. It was dusk, and Anthony Dexter sat in the library. Through the day he had wearied himself to the point of exhaustion, but his phantom pursuer had not tired. The veiled figure of Evelina had kept pace easily with his quick, nervous stride. At the point on the river road where he had met her the first time, she had indeed seemed to go ahead of him and wait for him there. Night brought no relief. By a singular fatality he could see her in darkness as plainly as in sunshine, and even when his eyes were closed, she hovered persistently before him. Throughout his drugged sleep she moved continuously. He never dreamed, save of her. In days gone by he had been certain that he was the victim of an hallucination, but now he was not so sure. He would not have sworn that the living Evelina was not eternally in his sight. Time and time again he had darted forward quickly to catch her, but she swiftly eluded him.
"If,"
he thought, gritting his teeth,
"I could once get my hands upon her."
His fist closed tightly, then, by a supreme effort of will, he put the maddening thought away.
"I will not add murder to my sins," he muttered. "No, by heaven, I will not."
By a whimsical change of his thought, he conceived himself dead and in his coffin. Would Evelina pace ceaselessly before him then? When he was in his grave, would she wait eternally at the foot of it, and would those burning eyes pierce the shielding sod that parted them? Life had not served to separate them. Could he hope that death would prove potent where life had failed? Ralph came in, tired, having done his father's work for the day. The room was wholly dark, but he paused upon the threshold, conscious that someone was there.
"Alone, father?"
he called cheerily.
"No,"
returned Anthony Dexter grimly.
"Who's here?" asked Ralph, stumbling into the room. "It's so dark I can't see."
Fumbling for a match, he lighted a wax candle which stood in an antique candlestick on the library table. The face of his father materialized suddenly out of the darkness, wearing an expression which made Ralph uneasy.
"I thought," he said, troubled, "that someone was with you." "Aren't you here?"
asked Anthony Dexter, trying to make his voice even.
"Oh," returned Ralph. "I see."
With the candle flickering uncertainly between them, the two men faced each other. Sharp shadows lay on the floor, and Anthony Dexter's profile was silhouetted upon the opposite wall. He noted that the figure of Evelina, pacing to and fro, cast no shadow. It seemed strange. In the endeavor to find some interesting subject upon which to talk, Ralph chanced upon the fatal one.
"Father," he began, "you know that this morning we were speaking of Miss Evelina?"
The tone was inquiring, but there was no audible answer.
"Well," continued Ralph, "I saw her again today, and I saw her face."
He had forgotten that his father had seen it also, and had told him only yesterday. Anthony Dexter almost leaped from his chair toward the veiled figure now approaching him.
Did she show you her face?"
he asked with difficulty.
"No, it was an accident. She often left the front door open for me when I was attending Araminta, and so today, when I found it open, I went in. She was asleep on the couch in the parlor, and she wore no veil."
At once the phantom Evelina changed her tactics. Hitherto she had walked back and forth from side to side of his vision. Now she advanced slowly toward him, and as slowly retreated. Her face was no longer averted. She walked backward cautiously, then advanced. From behind her veil he could feel her burning, accusing eyes.
"Father," said Ralph, "she is beautiful. She is the most beautiful woman I have ever seen in all my life. Her face is as exquisite as if chiseled in marble, and you never saw such eyes. And she wears that veil all the time."
Anthony Dexter's cold fingers were forced to drum on the table with apparent carelessness. Yes, he knew she was beautiful. He had not forgotten it for an instant since she had thrown back her veil and faced him.
Did she tell you why?"
he asked.
"Yes," answered Ralph. "She told me why."
A sword, suspended by a single hair, seemed swaying uncertainly over Anthony Dexter's head. A two-edged sword, sure to strike mercilessly if it fell. Ralph's eyes were upon him, but not in contempt. God, in his infinite pity, had made them kind.
"Father," said Ralph again, "she would not tell me the name of the man, though I begged her to."
Anthony Dexter's heart began to beat again, slowly at first, then with a sudden and unbearable swiftness. The blood thundered in his ears like the roar of a cataract. He could hardly hear what Ralph was saying.
"It was in a laboratory," the boy continued, though the words were almost lost. "She was there with the man she loved and whom she was pledged to marry. He was trying a new experiment, and she was watching. While he was leaning over the retort to put in another chemical, she heard the mass seethe and pushed him away just in time to save him. There was an explosion, and she was terribly burned. He was not touched, mind you. She had saved him. They took her to the hospital and wrapped her in bandages. He went there only once. There was another girl there named Evelyn Gray, who was so badly burned that every feature was destroyed. The two names became confused, and a mistake was made. They told him she would be disfigured for life, and so he went away."
The walls of the room swayed as though they were of fabric. The floor undulated, his chair rocked dizzily. Out of the accusing silence, Thorpe's words leapt to mock him.
"The honor of the spoken word still holds him. He asked her to marry him, and she consented. He was never released from his promise, did not even ask for it. He slunk away like a cur. Sometimes I think there is no sin but shirking. I can excuse a liar. I can pardon a thief. I can pity a murderer. But a shirk? No."
"Father," Ralph was saying, "you do not seem to understand. I suppose it's difficult for you to comprehend such cowardice. You have always done the square thing." The man winced, but the boy did not see it. "Try to think of a brute like that, father, and be glad that our name means right. She saved him from terrible disfigurement, if not from death. Having instinctively thrown up her right arm, she got the worst of it there, and on her shoulder. Her face was badly burned, but not so deeply as to be scarred. She showed me her shoulder. It's awful. I never seen anything like it. She said her arm was worse, but she did not show me that."
"He never knew?"
asked Anthony Dexter huskily. Ralph seemed to be demanding something of him, and the veiled figure, steadily advancing and retreating, demanded more still.
"No,"
answered Ralph. "He never knew. He went to the hospital only once. He had told her that very day that he loved her for the beautiful soul she had, and at the test his love failed. He never saw her again. He went away and married, and he has a son. Think of the son, father, only think of the son. Suppose he knew it. How could he ever bear a disgrace like that?"
"I do not know,"
muttered Anthony Dexter. His lips were cold and stiff, and he did not recognize his own voice.
"When she understood what had happened," Ralph continued, "and how he had deserted her forever after taking his cowardly life from her as a gift, her hair turned white. She has wonderful hair, father. It's heavy and white and dull. It does not shine. She wore the veil at first because she had to, because her face was healing, and before it had wholly healed, she had become accustomed to the shelter of it. Then, too, as she said, it kept people away from her. She could not be tempted to love or trust again."
There was an interval of silence, though the very walls seemed to be crying out, "Tell him! Tell him! Confess and purge your guilty soul!" The clock ticked loudly. The blood roared in his ears. His hands were cold and almost lifeless. His body seemed paralyzed, but he heard so acutely that it was agony.
"Miss Evelina said," resumed Ralph, "that she did not think he had told his son. Do you know what I was thinking, father, while she was talking? I was thinking of you, and how you had always done the square thing."
It seemed to Anthony Dexter that all the tortures of his laboratory had been chemically concentrated and were being poured out upon his head.
"Our name means right,"
said the boy proudly, and the man writhed in his chair. For a moment, the ghostly Evelina went to Ralph, her hands outstretched in disapproval. Immediately she returned to her former position, advancing, retreating, with the regularity of the tide.
"I begged her," continued Ralph, "to tell me the man's name, but she would not. He still lives, she said. He is happy and prosperous, and he has not suffered at all. For the honor of men, I want to punish that brute. Father, do you know that when I think of a cur like that, I believe I could rend him with my own hands?"
Anthony Dexter got to his feet unsteadily. The mist about him cleared, and the veiled figure whisked suddenly out of his sight. He went up to Ralph as he might walk to the scaffold, but his head was held high. All the anguish of his soul crystallized itself into one passionate word:
"Strike!"
For an instant the boy faced him, unbelieving. Then he remembered that his father had seen Miss Evelina's face, that he must have known she was beautiful, and why she wore the veil.
"Father!" he cried shrilly. "Oh, never you!"
Anthony Dexter looked into the eyes of his son until he could bear to look no more. The veiled figure no longer stood between them, but something else was there, infinitely more terrible. As he had watched the beating of the dog's bared heart, the man watched the boy's face. Incredulity, amazement, wonder, and fear resolved themselves gradually into conviction. Then came contempt, so deep and profound and permanent that from it there could never be appeal. With all the strength of his young and knightly soul, Ralph despised his father, and Anthony Dexter knew it.
"Father,"
whispered the boy hoarsely,
"it was never you. Tell me it isn't true. Just a word, and I'll believe you. For the sake of our manhood, Father, tell me it isn't true."
Anthony Dexter's head dropped, his eyes lowered before his son's. The cold sweat dripped from his face, his hands groped pitifully, like those of a blind man feeling his way in a strange place. His hands fumbled helplessly toward Ralph's, and the boy shrank back as though from the touch of a snake. With a deep-drawn breath of agony, the man flung himself, unseeing, out of the room. Ralph reeled like a drunken man against his chair. He sank into it helplessly, and his head fell forward on the table, his shoulders shaking with that awful grief which knows no tears.
"Father," he breathed. "Father. Father."
Upstairs, Anthony Dexter walked through the hall, followed or occasionally preceded by the ghostly figure of Evelina. Her veil was thrown back now and seemed a part of the mist which surrounded her. Sometimes he had told the patient that there was never a point beyond which human endurance could not be made to go. He knew now that he had lied. Ralph's unspoken condemnation had hurt him cruelly. He could have borne words, he thought, better than that look on his son's face. For the first time he realized how much he had cared for Ralph, how much, God help him, he cared for him still. Yet above it all, dominant, compelling, was man's supreme passion, that for his mate. As Evelina moved before him in her unveiled beauty, his hungry soul leapt to meet hers. Now, strangely, he loved her as he had loved her in the long ago, yet with an added grace. There was an element in his love that had never been there before, the mysterious bond which welds more firmly into one, two who have suffered together. He hungered for Ralph, for the strong young arm thrown about his shoulders in friendly fashion, for the eager, boyish laugh, the hearty word. He hungered for Evelina, radiant with a beauty no woman had ever worn before. Far past the promise of her girlhood, the noble, transfigured face, with its glory of lustreless white hair, set his pulses to throbbing wildly, and subtly, unconsciously, but not the less surely, he hungered for death. Anthony Dexter had cherished no sentiment about the end of life. To him it had seemed much the same as the stopping of a clock, and of as little moment. He had failed to see why such a fuss was made about the inevitable, though he had at times been scientifically interested in the hysterical effect he had produced in a household by announcing that within an hour or so a particular human clock might be expected to stop. It had never occurred to him either that a man had not a well-defined right to stop the clock of his own being whenever it seemed desirable or expedient. Now he thought of death as the final, beautiful solution of all mundane problems. If he were dead, Ralph could not look at him with contempt. The veiled or unveiled Evelina could not haunt him as she had remorselessly for months. Yes, death was beautiful, and he well knew how to make it sure. By an incredibly swift transition, his pain passed into an exquisite pleasure. The woman he loved was walking in the hall before him. The son he loved was downstairs. What man could have more? For sudden, the worst turns the best to the brave, the black minutes at end. And the elements rage, the fiend voices that rave, shall dwindle, shall blend, shall change, shall become first a peace out of pain, then a light, then thy breast. O thou soul of my soul, I shall clasp thee again, and with God be the rest. The wonderful words sang themselves over in his consciousness. He smiled, and the unveiled Evelina smiled back at him with infinite tenderness, infinite love. Tonight he would sleep as he had not slept before, in the sleep that knows no waking. He had the tiny white tablets, plenty of them, but the fancy seized him to taste this last bitterness to the full. He took a wine-glass from his chiffonier. Those white, blunt figures had never been more steady than now. He lifted the vial on high and poured out the laudanum, faltering no more than when he had guided the knife in an operation that made him famous throughout the state.
"Evelina,"
he said, his voice curiously soft,
"I pledge you now in a bond that cannot break."
Was it fancy, or did the violet eyes soften with tears, even though the scarlet lips smiled? He drank. The silken petals of the poppies, crushed into the peace that passeth all understanding, began their gentle ministry. He made his way back to his bed, put out his candle, and lay down. The spirit of the poppies stood before him, a woman with a face like Evelina's, but her garments were scarlet, and Evelina always wore black. In the darkness he could not distinguish clearly.
"Evelina,"
he called aloud,
"come. Come to me and put your hand in mine."
At once she seemed to answer him, wholly tender, wholly kind. Was he dreaming, or did Evelina come and kneel beside him? He groped for her hand, but it eluded him.
"Evelina,"
he said again,
"dear heart, come. Forgive."
He breathed drowsily.
"Oh, only forgive."
Then, as if by a miracle, her hand slipped into his, and he felt his head drawn tenderly to man's first and last resting place, a woman's breast. And so, after a little, Anthony Dexter slept. The spirit of the poppies had claimed her own at last. End of chapter 21. The poppies claim their own. Chapter 22 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Bellwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 22. Forgiveness. Haggard and worn after a sleepless night, Ralph went downstairs. Heavily upon his young shoulders he bore the burden of his father's disgrace. Through their kinship, the cowardice and the shirking became a part of his heritage. There was nothing to be done, for he could not raise his hand in anger against his own father. They must continue to live together and keep an unbroken front to the world, even though the bond between them had come to be the merest pretense. He despised his father, but no one must ever know it, not even the father whom he despised. Ralph did not guess that his father had read his face. He saw now why Miss Evelina had refused to tell him the man's name, and he honored her for her reticence. He perceived, too, the hideous temptation with which she was grappling when she begged him to leave her. She had feared that she would tell him, and he must never let her suspect that he knew. The mighty, unseen forces that lie beneath our daily living were surging through Ralph's troubled soul. Love, hatred, shame, remorse, anger, despair. The words are but symbols of things that work devastation within. Behold a man, in all outward seeming a gentleman. Observe his courtesy, refinement, and consideration, his perfect self-control. Note his mastery of the lower nature, and see the mind in complete triumph over the beast. Remark his education, the luxury of his surroundings, and the fine quality of his thought. Wonder at the high levels wherein his life is laid, and marvel at the perfect adjustment between him and his circumstances. Subject this man to the onslaught of some vast cyclonic passion, and see the barriers crumble, then fall. See all the artifice of civilization swept away at one fell stroke, and behold your gentleman transformed in an instant into a beast, with all a beast's primeval qualities. Under stress like this, Ralph was fighting to regain his self-mastery. He knew that he must force himself to sit opposite his father at the table and exchange the daily commonplace talk. No one must ever suspect that anything was amiss. It is this demand of society which keeps the structure in place and draws the line between civilization and barbarism. He knew that he never again could look his father straight in the face, that he must always avoid his eyes. It would be hard at first, but Ralph had never given up anything simply because it was difficult. It was a relief to find that he was downstairs first. Hearing his father's step upon the stair, he thought, would enable him to steel himself more surely to the inevitable meeting. After they had once spoken together, it would be easier. At length they might even become accustomed to the ghastly thing that lay between them, and veil it, as it were, with commonplaces. Ralph took up the morning paper and pretended to read, though the words danced all over the page. The old housekeeper brought in his breakfast, and likewise he affected to eat. An hour went by, and still the dreaded step did not sound upon the stair. At length the old housekeeper said, with a certain timid deference, "Your father's very late this morning, Dr. Ralph. He has never been so late before." "He'll be down presently. He's probably overslept." "It's not your father's way to oversleep. Hadn't you better go up and see?" Thus forced, Ralph went leisurely upstairs, intending only to rap upon the door, which was always closed. Perhaps, with the closed door between them, the first speech might be easier. He rapped once with hesitation, then again more definitely. There was no answer. Wholly without suspicion, Ralph opened the door and went in. Anthony Dexter lay upon his bed, fully dressed. On his face was a smile of ineffable peace. Ralph went to him quickly, shook him, and felt his pulse, but vainly. The heart of the man made no answer to the questioning fingers of his son. The eyes were closed, and, his hands trembling now, Ralph forced them open. The contracted pupils gave him all the information he needed. He found the wine-glass, which still smelled of laudanum. He washed it carefully, put it away, then went downstairs. His first sensation was entirely relief. Anthony Dexter had chosen the one sure way out. Ralph had a distinct sense of gratitude until he remembered that death did not end disgrace. Never again need he look in his father's eyes. There was no imperative demand that he should conceal his contempt. With the hiding of Anthony Dexter's body beneath the shriving sod, all would be over, save memory. Could he put by this memory as his father had his? Ralph did not know. The sorrowful preliminaries were all over before Ralph's feeling was in any way changed. Then, The pity of it all overwhelmed him in a blinding flood. Searching for something or someone to lean upon, his thought turned to Miss Evelina. Surely now he might go to her. If comfort was to be had of any sort, he could find it there. At any rate, they were bound, much as his father had been bound to her before, by the logic of events. He went uphill, scarcely knowing how he made his way. Miss Evelina, veiled as usual, opened the door for him. Ralph stumbled across the threshold, crying out, "My father is dead! He died by his own hand!" "Yes," returned Miss Evelina quietly. "I have heard. I am sorry for you."
"You need not be," flashed Ralph quickly. "It is for us, my father and I, to be sorry for you, to make amends, if any amends can be made by the living or the dead."
Miss Evelina started. He knew then? And it had not been necessary for her to draw out the sheathed dagger which only yesterday she had held in her hand? The glittering vengeance had gone home, through no direct agency of hers.
"Miss Evelina," cried the boy, "I have come to ask you to forgive my father."
A silence fell between them, as cold and forbidding as death itself. After an interval which seemed an hour, Miss Evelina spoke. "He never asked," she said. Her tone was icy, repellent.
"I know," answered Ralph despairingly, "but I, his son, ask it. Anthony Dexter's son asks you to forgive Anthony Dexter, not to let him go to his grave unforgiven."
"He never asked," said Miss Evelina again, stubbornly.
"His need is all the greater for that," pleaded the boy, "and mine. Have you thought of my need of it? My name meant right until my father changed its meaning. Don't you see that unless you forgive my father, I can never hold up my head again?"
What the piper had said to Evelina came back to her now, eloquent with appeal.
"The word is not made right. I'm thinking 'tis wrong, and too, as many things in this world are until we move and look at them from another way. It's giving for, that's all. When you have put self so wholly aside that you can be sorry for him because he has wronged you, why, then you have forgiven."
She moved about restlessly. It seemed to her that she could never be sorry for Anthony Dexter because he had wronged her, that she could never grow out of the hurt of her own wrong.
"Come with me," said Ralph, choking. "I know it's a hard thing I ask of you. God knows I haven't forgiven him myself, but I know I've got to, and you'll have to, too. Miss Evelina, you've got to forgive him, or I can never bear my disgrace."
She let him lead her out of the house. On the long way to Anthony Dexter's no word passed between them, only the sound of their footfalls, and Ralph's long, choking breaths, half sobs, broke the silence. At the gate the usual knot of curious people had gathered. They were wondering, in undertones, how one so skilful as Dr. Dexter had happened to take an overdose of laudanum, but they stood by respectfully to make way for Ralph and the mysterious veiled woman in black. The audible whispers followed them up to the very door. Who is she? What has she to do with him? As yet Anthony Dexter's body lay in his own room. Ralph led Miss Evelina in and closed the door.
"Here he is," sobbed the boy. "He has gone and left the shame for me. Forgive him, Miss Evelina, for the love of God. Forgive him."
Evelina sighed. She was standing close to Anthony Dexter now, without fear. She had no wish to torture him as she once had with the sight of her unveiled face. It was the man she had loved now. The emotion which had made him hideous to her was past and gone. To her, as to him the night before, death seemed the solution of all problems, the supreme answer to all perplexing questions. Ralph crept out of the room and closed the door so softly that she did not hear. She was alone, as every woman some day is, alone with her dead. She threw back her veil. The morning sun lay strong upon Anthony Dexter's face, revealing every line. Death had been kind to him at last, had closed the tortured eyes, blotted out the lines of cruelty around his mouth, and changed the mask-like expression to a tender calm. A hint of the old loving smile was there. Once again he was the man she had loved, but the love itself had burned out of her heart long ago. He was naught to her, nor she to him. The doorknob turned, and quickly she lowered her veil. Piper Tom came in with a soft, slow step. He did not seem to see Miss Evelina. One would have said he did not know she was in the room. He went straight to Anthony Dexter, and laid his warm hand upon the cold one.
"Man," he said, "I've come to say I forgive you for hurting laddie. I'm not thinking now that you would have done it if you had known. I'm sorry for you because you could do it. I've forgiven you, as I hope God will forgive you for that, and for everything else."
Then he turned to Evelina and whispered, as though to keep the dead from hearing,
"'Twas hard, but I've done it. 'Tis easier, I'm thinking, to forgive the dead than the living."
He went out again as silently as he had come, and closed the door. Was it, in truth, easier to forgive the dead? In her inmost soul, Evelina knew that she could not have cherished lifelong resentment against any other person in the world. To those we love most, we are invariably most cruel. But she did not love him now. The man she had loved was no more than a stranger, and from a stranger can come no intentional wrong.
"O God,"
prayed Evelina for the first time, "help me to forgive." She threw back her veil once more. They were face to face at last, with only a prayer between. His mute helplessness pleaded with her, and Ralph's despairing cry rang in her ears. The estranging mists cleared, and, in truth, she put self aside. Intuitively she saw how he had suffered since the night he came to her to make it right if he could. He must have suffered, unless he were more than human.
"Dear God," she prayed again, "oh, help me forgive."
All at once there was a change. The light seemed thrown into the uttermost places of her darkened soul. She illumined, and a wave of infinite pity swept her from head to foot. She leaned forward, her hands seeking his, and upon Anthony Dexter's dead face there fell the forgiving baptism of her tears. In the hall, as she went out, she encountered Miss Mehitable. That face, too, was changed. She had not come, as comes that ghoulish procession of merest acquaintances, to gloat, living, over the helpless dead. At the sight of Evelina, she retreated.
"I'll go back," murmured Miss Mehitable, enigmatically. "You had the best right."
Evelina went downstairs and home again, but Miss Mehitable did not enter that silent room. The third day came, and there was no resurrection. Since the miracle of Easter, the world has waited its 3 days for the dead to rise again. Ralph sat in the upper hall just beyond the turn of the stair, and beside him, unveiled, was Miss Evelina.
"It's you and I," he had pleaded. "Don't you see that? Have you never thought that you should have been my mother?"
From below, in Thorpe's deep voice, came the words of the burial service.
"I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live."
For a few moments Thorpe spoke of death as the inevitable end of life, and our ignorance of what lies beyond. He spoke of that mystic veil which never parts save for a passage, and from behind which no word ever comes. He said that life was a rainbow spanning brilliantly the two silences, that man's ceasing was no more strange than his beginning, and that the God who ordained the beginning had also ordained the end. He said, too, that the love which gave life might safely be trusted with that same life at its mysterious conclusion. At length he struck the personal note.
"It is hard for me," Thorpe went on, "to perform this last service for my friend. All of you are my friends, but the one who lies here was especially dear. He was a man of few friendships, and I was privileged to come close, to know him as he was. His life was clean, and upon his record there rests no shadow of disgrace."
At this Ralph in the upper hall buried his face in his hands. Miss Evelina sat quietly, to all intents and purposes unmoved.
"He was a brave man," Thorpe was saying, "a valiant soldier on the great battlefield of the world. He met his temptations face to face and conquered them. For him there was no such thing as cowardice. He never shirked. He met every responsibility like a man and never swerved aside. He took his share, and more, of the world's work, and did it nobly, as a man should do. His brusque manner concealed a great heart. I fear that at times some of you may have misunderstood him. There was no man in our community more deeply and lovingly the friend of us all, and there is no man among us more noble in thought and act than he. We who have known him cannot but be the better for the knowing. It would be a beautiful world indeed if we were all as good as he. We cannot fail to be inspired by his example. Through knowing him, each of us is better fitted for life. We can conquer cowardice more easily, meet our temptations more valiantly, and more surely keep from the sin of shirking, because Anthony Dexter has lived. To me,
said Thorpe, his voice breaking,
it is the greatest loss, save one that I have ever known. But it is only through our own sorrow that we come to understand the sorrow of others. Only through our own weaknesses that we can learn to pity the weaknesses of others. And only through our own love and forgiveness that we can ever comprehend the infinite love and forgiveness of God. If any of you have ever thought he wronged you in some small, insignificant way, I give you my word that it was entirely unintentional, and I bespeak for him your pardon. He goes to his grave today to wait in the great silence for the final solution of God's infinite mysteries, and, as you and I believe, for God's sure reward. He goes with the love of us all, with the forgiveness of us all, and with the hope of us all that when we come to die, we may be as certain of heaven as he.
Perceiving that his grief was overmastering him, Thorpe proceeded quickly to the benediction. In the pause that followed, Ralph leaned toward the woman who sat beside him.
"Have you," he breathed, "forgiven him? And me?"
Miss Evelina nodded, her beautiful eyes shining with tears.
"Mother,"
said Ralph thickly. Like a hurt child he went to her and sobbed his heart out in the shelter of her arms. End of chapter 22. Forgiveness. Chapter 23 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Bellwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 23. Undine Finds Her Soul. The year was at its noon. Every rose bush was glorious with bloom, and even the old climbing rose which clung in its decay to Miss Mehitable's porch railing had put forth a few fragrant blossoms. Soon after Araminta had been carried back home, she discovered that she had changed since she went away. Aunt Hitty no longer seemed infallible. Indeed, Araminta had admitted to herself, though with the pangs of a guilty conscience, that it was possible for Aunt Hitty to be mistaken. It was probable that the entire knowledge of the world was not concentrated in Aunt Hitty. Outwardly, things went on as usual. Miss Mehitable issued orders to Araminta as the commander-in-chief of an army issues instructions to his subordinates, and Araminta obeyed as faithfully as before, yet with a distinct difference. She did what she was told to do out of gratitude for lifelong care, and not because she felt that she had to. She went frequently to see Miss Evelina, having disposed of objections by the evident fact that she could not neglect anyone who had been so kind to her as Miss Evelina had. Usually, however, the faithful guardian went along, and the three sat in the garden, Evelina with her frail hands listlessly folded, and the others stitching away at the endless and monotonous patchwork. Miss Mehitable had a secret fear that the bloom had been brushed from her rose. Until the accident, Araminta had scarcely been out of her sight since she brought her home, a toddling infant. Miss Mehitable's mind had unerringly controlled two bodies until Araminta fell off the ladder. Now the other mind began to show distressing signs of activity. By dint of extra work, Araminta's 8th patchwork quilt was made for quilting, and the Ladies' Aid Society was invited to Miss Mehitable's for the usual summer revelry of quilting and gossip. Miss Evelina was invited, but she refused to go. After the festivity was over, Miss Mehitable made a fruitful excavation into a huge chest in the attic, and emerged, flushed but happy, with enough scraps for 3 quilts. "This here next quilt, Minty," she said, with the air of one announcing a pleasant surprise, "will be the rising sun and star pattern. It's harder than the others, and that's why I kept it till now. You done all them other quilts real good," she added grudgingly. Araminta had her own surprise ready, but it was not of a pleasant nature. "Thank you, Aunt Hitty," she replied, "but I'm not going to make any more quilts, for a while at any rate." Miss Mehitable's lower jaw dropped in amazement. Never before had Araminta failed to obey her suggestions. "Minty," she said anxiously, "don't you feel right? It was hot yesterday, and the excitement and all, I don't know, but you may have had a stroke." Araminta smiled, a lovable, winning smile. "No, I haven't had any stroke, but I've made all the quilts I'm going to until I get to be an old woman and have nothing else to do." "What are you laying out to do, Minty?" demanded Miss Mehitable. "I'm going to be outdoors all I want to, and I'm going up to Miss Evelina's and play with my kitten, and help you with the housework, or do anything else you want me to do, but no more quilts," concluded the girl firmly. "Araminta Lee," cried Miss Mehitable, speech having returned, "if I ain't ashamed of you! Here's your poor old aunt that's worked her fingers to the bone, slaving for you almost ever since the day you was born, and paying a doctor's outrageous bill of $4.50, or going to pay," she corrected, her conscience reproaching her, "and you refusing to mind. Haven't I took good care of you all these 18 years? Haven't I set up with you when you was sick and never let you out of my sight for a minute, and taught you to be as good a housekeeper as any in Rushton, and made you into a first-class seamstress, and educated you myself, and looked after your religious training and made your clothes? Ain't I been father and mother and sister and brother and teacher and grandparents all rolled into one? And now you're refusing to make quilts." Araminta's heart reproached her, but the blood of some fighting ancestor was in her pulses now. "I know, Aunt Hitty," she said kindly. "You've done all that and more, and I'm not in the least ungrateful, though you may think so. But I'm not going to make any more quilts." "Araminta Lee," said Miss Mehitable warningly, "look careful where you're stepping. Hell is yawning in front of you this very minute." Araminta smiled sweetly. Since the day the minister had gone to see her, she had had no fear of hell. "I don't see it, Aunt Hitty," she said, "but if everybody who hasn't pieced more than 8 quilts by hand is in there, it must be pretty crowded." "Araminta Lee," cried Miss Mehitable, "you're your mother all over again. She got just as high-stepping as you before her downfall, and see where she ended at. She was married," concluded the accuser scornfully. "Yes, actually married." "Aunt Hitty, said Araminta, her sweet mouth quivering ever so little. "Your mother was married too, wasn't she?" With this parting shaft the girl went out of the room, her head held high. Miss Mehitable stared after her, uncomprehending. Slowly it dawned upon her that someone had been telling tales and undoing her careful work. "Minty! Minty!" she cried. "How can you talk to me so?" But Minty was outdoors and on her way to Miss Evelina's, bareheaded, this being strictly forbidden, so she did not hear. She was hoping against hope that some day at Miss Evelina's she might meet Dr. Ralph again and tell him she was sorry she had broken his heart. Since the day he went away from her, Araminta had not even a glimpse of him. She had gone to his father's funeral, as everyone else in the village did, and had wondered that he was not in the front seat where, in her brief experience of funerals, mourners usually sat. She admitted to herself that she had gone to the funeral solely for the sake of seeing Dr. Ralph. Araminta was wholly destitute of curiosity regarding the dead, and she had not joined the interested procession which wound itself around Anthony Dexter's coffin before passing out regretfully at the front door. Neither had Miss Mehitable. At the time, Araminta had thought it strange, for at all previous occasions of the kind within her remembrance, Aunt Hitty had been well up among the mourners, and had usually gone around the casket twice. At Miss Evelina's she knocked in vain. There was white chiffon upon the line, but all the doors were locked. Dr. Ralph was not there either, and even the kitten was not in sight, so, regretfully, Araminta went home again. Throughout the day Miss Mehitable did not speak to her erring niece, but Araminta felt it to be a relief rather than a punishment. In the afternoon the emancipated young woman put on her best gown, a white cross-barred muslin which she had made herself. It was not Sunday, and Araminta was forbidden to wear the glorified raiment save on occasions of high state. She added further to her sins by picking a pink rose. Miss Mehitable did not think flowers were made to pick, and fastening it coquettishly in her brown hair. Moreover, Araminta had put her hair up loosely, instead of the neat tight wad which Miss Mehitable had forced upon her the day she donned long skirts. When Miss Mehitable beheld her transformed charge, she would have broken her vow of silence had not the words mercifully failed. Aunt Hitty's vocabulary was limited, and she had no language in which to express her full opinion of the wayward one, so she assumed instead the pose of a suffering martyr. The atmosphere at the table during supper was icy, even though it was the middle of June. Thorpe noticed it and endeavored to talk, but was not successful. Miss Mehitable's few words, which were invariably addressed to him, were so acrid in quality that they made him nervous. The Reverend Austin Thorpe, innocent as he was of all intentional wrong, was made to feel like a criminal haled to the bar of justice. But Araminta glowed and dimpled and smiled. Her eyes danced with mischief, and the color came and went upon her velvety cheeks. She took pains to ask Aunt Hitty for the salt or the bread, and kept up a continuous flow of high-spirited talk. Had it not been for Araminta, the situation would have become openly strained. Afterward she began to clear up the dishes as usual, but Miss Mehitable pushed her out of the room with a violence indicative of suppressed passion. So, humming a hymn at an irreverent tempo, Araminta went out and sat down on the front porch, spreading down the best rug in the house that she might not soil her gown. This, also, was forbidden. When the dishes were washed and put away, Miss Mehitable came out, clad in her rustling black silk and her best bonnet. "Miss Lee," she said very coldly, "I am going out." "All right, Aunt Hitty," returned Araminta cheerfully. "As it happens, I'm not." Miss Mehitable repressed an exclamation of horror. Seemingly, then, it had occurred to Araminta to go out in the evening, alone. Miss Mehitable's feet moved swiftly away from the house. She was going to the residence of the oldest and most orthodox deacon in Thorpe's church to ask for guidance in dealing with her wayward charge, but Araminta never dreamed of this. Dusk came, the sweet June dusk, starred with fireflies and clouded with great white moths. The roses and mignonette and honeysuckle made the air delicately fragrant. To the emancipated one, it was indeed a beautiful world. Austin Thorpe came out, having found his room unbearably close. As the nearsighted sometimes do, he saw more clearly at twilight than at other times.
"You here, child?" he asked.
"Yes, I'm here," replied Araminta happily. "Sit down, won't you?" Having taken the first step, she found the others comparatively easy, and was rejoicing in her new freedom. She felt sure, too, that some day she should see Dr. Ralph once more, and all would be made right between them. The minister sat down gladly, his old heart yearning toward Araminta as toward a loved and only child.
"Where is your aunt?" he asked timidly.
"Goodness knows," laughed Araminta irreverently. "She's gone out in all her best clothes. She didn't say whether she was coming back or not."
Thorpe was startled, for he had never heard speech like this from Araminta. He knew her only as a docile, timid child. Now she seemed suddenly to have grown up. For her part, Araminta remembered how the minister had once helped her out of a difficulty and taken away from her forever the terrible, haunting fear of hell. Here was a dazzling opportunity to acquire new knowledge.
"Mr. Thorpe," she demanded eagerly, "what is it to be married?"
"To be married,"
repeated Austin Thorpe dreamily, his eyes fixed upon a firefly that flitted star-like near the rose,
"is, I think, the nearest this world can come to heaven."
"Oh!" cried Araminta in astonishment. "What does it mean?"
"It means," answered Thorpe softly, "that a man and a woman whom God meant to be mated have found each other at last. It means there is nothing in the world that you have to face alone, that all your joys are doubled and all your sorrows shared. It means that there is no depth into which you can go alone, that one other hand is always in yours, trusting, clinging, tender, to help you bear whatever comes. It means that the infinite love has been given in part to you, for daily strength and comfort. It is a balm for every wound, a spur for every lagging, a sure dependence in every weakness, a belief in every doubt. The perfect being is neither man nor woman, but a merging of dual natures into a united whole. To be married gives a man a woman's tenderness, a woman a man's courage. The long years stretch before them, and what lies beyond no one can say, but they face it, smiling and serene, because they are together."
"My mother was married," said Araminta softly. All at once the stain of disgrace was wiped out.
"Yes, dear child, and I hope to the man she loved, as I hope that some day you will be married to the man who loves you."
Araminta's whole heart yearned toward Ralph, yearned unspeakably. In something else, surely, Aunt Hitty was wrong.
"Araminta," said Thorpe, his voice shaking, "dear child, come here."
She followed him into the house. His trembling old hands lighted a candle, and she saw that his eyes were full of tears. From an inner pocket he drew out a small case, wrapped in many thicknesses of worn paper. He unwound it reverently, his face alight with a look she had never seen there before.
"See,"
he said. He opened the ornate case and showed her an old daguerreotype. A sweet, girlish face looked out at her, a woman with trusting, loving eyes, a sweet mouth, and dark, softly parted hair. "Oh," whispered Araminta, Were you married to her?
No,
answered Thorpe hoarsely, shutting the case with a snap and beginning to wrap it again in the many folds of paper.
I was to have been married to her.
His voice lingered with inexpressible fondness upon the words.
She died,
he said, his lips quivering. Oh, cried the girl, I'm sorry. A sharp pang pierced her through and through.
Child,
said Thorpe, his wrinkled hand closing on hers,
to those that love, there is no such thing as death. Do you think that just because she is dead I have ceased to care? Death has made her mine as life could never do. She walks beside me daily, as though we were hand in hand. Her tenderness makes me tender. Her courage gives me strength. Her great charity makes me kind. Her belief has made my own faith more sure. Her steadfastness keeps me from faltering, and her patience enables me to wait until the end, when I go into the unknown to meet her. Child, I do not know if there be a heaven, but if God gives me her and her love, as I knew it once, I shall not ask for more.
Unable to say more for the tears, Thorpe stumbled out of the room. Araminta's own eyes were wet, and her heart was strangely tender to all the world. Miss Evelina, the kitten, Mr. Thorpe, Dr. Ralph, even Aunt Hitty, were all included in a wave of unspeakable tenderness. Never stopping to question, Araminta sped out of the house, her feet following where her heart led. Past the crossroads to the right, down into the village, across the tracks, then sharply to the left, up to Dr. Dexter's, where only a few weeks before she had gone in the hope of seeing Dr. Ralph. Araminta ran like some young Atalanta, across whose path no golden apples were thrown. The door was open, and she rushed in, unthinking, turning by instinct into the library, where Ralph sat alone, leaning his head upon his hand. "Dr. Ralph," she cried, "I've come." He looked up, then started forward. One look into her glorified face told him all that he needed to know.
"Aunt Jane," he said huskily, "have you found your soul?"
"I don't know what I've found," sobbed Araminta from the shelter of his arms, "but I've come to stay with you always, if you'll let me."
"If I'll let you," murmured Ralph, kissing away her happy tears. "You little saint. It's what I want, as I want nothing else in the world."
"I know what it is to be married," said Araminta after a little, her grave, sweet eyes on his. "I asked Mr. Thorpe tonight, and he told me. It's to be always with the one you love, and never to mind what anybody else says or does. It's to help each other bear everything and be twice as happy because you're together. It means that somebody will always help you when things go wrong, and there will always be something you can lean on. You'll never be afraid of anything because you're together. My mother was married, your mother was married, and I found out that Aunt Hitty's mother was married too. And Mr. Thorpe, he would have been married, but she died. He told me, and he showed me her picture, and he says that it doesn't make any difference to be dead when you love anybody, and that heaven, for him, will be where she waits for him and puts her hand in his again. He was crying, and so was I, but it's because he has her, and I have you."
"Sweetheart, darling," cried Ralph, crushing her into his close embrace, "it's God himself who brought you to me now."
"No," returned Araminta, missing the point. "I came all by myself, and I ran all the way. Nobody brought me, but I've come for always, and I'll never leave you again. I'm sorry I broke your heart."
"You've made it well again," he said fondly, "and so we'll be married, you and I."
"Yes," repeated Araminta, her beautiful face alight with love. "We'll be married, you and I."
"Sweet," he said. "Do you think I deserve so much?"
"Being married is giving everything," she explained. "But I haven't anything at all. Only 8 quilts and me. Do you care for quilts?"
"Quilts be everlastingly condemned. I'm going to tell Aunt Hitty."
"No," said Araminta. "I'm going to tell her my own self, so now, and I'll tell her tomorrow." It was after 10 when Ralph took Araminta home. From the parlor window Miss Mehitable was watching anxiously. She had divested herself of the rustling black silk and was safely screened by the shutters. She had been at home an hour or more, and though she had received plenty of good advice of a stern nature from her orthodox counselor, her mind was far from at rest. Having conjured up all sorts of dire happenings, she was relieved when she heard voices outside. Miss Mehitable peered out eagerly from behind the shutters. Up the road came Araminta. "May the saints preserve us with a man!" Miss Mehitable quickly placed him as that blackmailing play doctor who now should never have his $4.50 unless he collected it by law. Only in the last ditch would she surrender. They were talking and laughing, and Ralph's black-coated arm was around Araminta's white-robed waist. They came slowly to the gate, where they stopped. Araminta laid her hand confidingly upon Ralph's shoulder, and he held her tightly in his arms, kissing her repeatedly, as Miss Mehitable guessed, though she could not see very well. At last they parted, and Araminta ran lightly up into the house, saying in a low, tender voice, "Tomorrow, dear, tomorrow." She went upstairs, singing. Even then Miss Mehitable observed that it was not a hymn, but some light and ungodly tune she had picked up heaven knew where. She went into her room, still humming, and presently her light was out, but her guardian angel was too stiff with horror to move. "O Lord," prayed Araminta as she sank to sleep, "keep me from the contamination of not being married to him, for thy sake. Amen." End of chapter 23. Undine finds her soul. Chapter 24 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Bellwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 24. Telling Aunt Hitty. Araminta woke with the birds. As yet it was dark, but from afar came the cheery voice of a robin piping gaily of coming dawn. When the first ray of light crept into her room, and every bird from miles around was swelling his tiny throat in song, it seemed to her that until now she had never truly lived. The bird that rocked on the maple branch outside her window, caroling with all his might, was no more free than she. Love had rolled away the stone Aunt Hitty had set before the door of Araminta's heart, and the imprisoned thing was trying its wings as joyously as the birds themselves. Every sense was exquisitely alive and thrilling. Had she been older and known more of the world, love would not have come to her so, but rather with a great peace, an unending trust. But having waked as surely as the sleeping princess in the tower, she knew the uttermost ecstasy of it, heard the sound of singing trumpets, and saw the white light. Her fear of Aunt Hitty had died, mysteriously and suddenly. She appreciated now as never before all that had been done for her. She saw, too, that many things had been done that were better left undone. But in her happy heart was no condemnation for anybody or anything. Araminta dressed leisurely. Usually she hurried into her clothes and ran downstairs to help Aunt Hitty, who was always ready for the day's work before anybody else was awake. But this morning she took her time. She loved the coolness of the water on her face. She loved her white, plump arms, her softly rounded throat, the velvety roses that blossomed on her cheeks, and the wavy brown masses of her hair, touched by the sun into tints of copper and gold. For the first time in all her life, Araminta realized that she was beautiful. She did not know that love brings beauty with it, nor that the light in her eyes, like a new star, had not risen until last night. She was seriously tempted to slide down the banister, this also having been interdicted since her earliest remembrance, but, being a grown woman now, she compromised with herself by taking 2 stairs at a time in a light, skipping, perilous movement that landed her safe but breathless in the lower hall. In the kitchen, wearing an aspect distinctly funereal, was Miss Mehitable. Her brisk, active manner was gone, and she moved slowly. She did not once look up as Araminta came in. "Good morning, Aunt Hitty," cried the girl, pirouetting around the bare floor. "Isn't this the beautifulest morning that ever was? And aren't you glad you're alive?" "No," returned Miss Mehitable acidly, "I am not." "Aren't you?" asked Araminta casually, too happy to be deeply concerned about anybody else. "Why? What's wrong?" "I should think, Araminta Lee, that you'd be the last one on earth to ask what's wrong." The floodgates were open now. "Wasn't it only yesterday that you broke away from all restraint and refused to make any more quilts? Didn't you put on your best dress in the afternoon when 'twa'n't Sunday, and I hadn't told you that you could? Didn't you pick a rose and stick it in your hair, and have I ever allowed you to pick a flower on the place, to say nothing of doing anything so foolish as to put it in your hair? Flowers and hair don't go together." "There's hair in the parlor," objected Araminta frivolously, "made up into a wreath of flowers, so I thought, as long as you had them made out of dead people's hair, I'd put some roses in mine now, while I'm alive." Miss Mehitable compressed her lips sternly and went on. "Didn't you take a rug out of the parlor last night and spread it on the porch, and have I ever had rugs outdoor except when they was being beat? And didn't you sit down on the front porch where I never allowed you to sit, it not being modest for a young female to sit outside of her house?" "Yes," admitted Araminta cheerfully, "I did all those things, and I put my hair up loosely instead of tightly, as you've always taught me. You forgot that." "No, I didn't," denied Miss Mehitable vigorously. "I was coming to that. Didn't you go up to Miss Evelina's without asking me if you could, and didn't you go bareheaded, as I've never allowed you to do?" "Yes," laughed Araminta, "I did." "After I went away," pursued Miss Mehitable, swiftly approaching her climax, "didn't you go up to Dr. Dexter's like a shameless hussy?" "If it makes a shameless hussy of me to go to Dr. Dexter's, that's what I am." "You went there to see Dr. Ralph Dexter, didn't you?" "Yes, I did," sang Araminta. "And, oh, Aunt Hitty, he was there. He was there." "Ain't I told you," demanded Miss Mehitable, "how one woman went up there when she had no business to go, and got burnt so awful that she has to wear a veil all the rest of her life?" "Yes, you told me, Aunt Hitty, but you see, I didn't get burned." "Araminta Lee, you're going right straight to hell just as fast as you can get there. Perdition is yawning at your feet. Didn't that blackmailing play doctor come home with you?" "Ralph," said Araminta, and the way she spoke his name made it a caress. "Ralph came home with me." "I saw you coming home," continued Miss Mehitable, with her sharp eyes keenly fixed upon the culprit. "I saw his arm around your waist, and you leaning your head on his shoulder." "Yes," laughed Araminta, "I haven't forgotten. I can feel his arms around me now." "And at the gate, you needn't deny it, for I saw it all. He kissed you." That's right, Aunt Hitty. At his house he kissed me too, lots and lots of times. And, she added, her eyes meeting her accuser's clearly, I kissed him. How do you suppose I feel to see such goings-on after all I've done for you? You needn't have looked, Auntie, if you didn't like to see it. Do you know where I went when I went out? I went up to Deacon Robinson's to lay your case before him. Miss Mehitable paused, for the worthy deacon was the fearsome spectre of young sinners. Araminta executed an intricate dance step of her own devising, but did not seem interested in the advice he had given. He told me, went on Miss Mehitable, in the manner of a judge pronouncing sentence upon a criminal, that at any cost I must trample down this godless uprising and assert my rightful authority. Honor thy father and thy mother, the Bible says, and I'm your father and mother rolled into one. He said, if I couldn't make you listen in any other way, it would be right and proper for me to shut you up in your room and keep you on bread and water until you came to your senses. Araminta giggled. I wouldn't be there long, she said. How funny it would be for Ralph to come with a ladder and take me out. Araminta Lee, what do you mean? Why, explained the girl, we're going to be married, Ralph and I. A nihilist bomb thrown into the immaculate kitchen could not have surprised Miss Mehitable more. She had no idea that it had gone so far. Married? She gasped. You? Oh, not just me alone, Auntie, but Ralph and I. There has to be two, and I'm of age, so I can if I want to. This last heresy had been learned from Ralph only the night before. Married? Gasped Miss Mehitable again. Yes, returned Araminta firmly, married. My mother was married, and Ralph's mother was married, and your mother was married. Everybody's mother is married. And Mr. Thorpe says it's the nearest there is to heaven. He was going to be married himself, but she died. Dear Aunt Hitty, cooed Araminta with winning sweetness, don't look so frightened. It's nothing dreadful. It's only natural and right, and I'm the happiest girl the sun shines on today. Don't be selfish, Auntie. You've had me all my life, and it's his turn now. I'll come to see you every day, and you can come and see me. Kiss me and tell me you're glad I'm going to be married. At this juncture Thorpe entered the kitchen, not aware that he was on forbidden ground. Attracted by the sound of voices, he had come in just in time to hear Araminta's last words. Dear child, he said, his fine old face illumined, and so you're going to be married to the man you love. I'm so glad. God bless you. He stooped and kissed Araminta gently upon the forehead. Having thus seen, as it were, the sanction of the church placed upon Araminta's startling announcement, Miss Mehitable could say no more. During breakfast she did not speak at all, even to Thorpe. Araminta chattered gleefully of everything under the blue heaven, and even the minister noted the liquid melody of her voice. Afterward she went out as naturally as a flower turns toward the sun. It was a part of the magic beauty of the world that she should meet Ralph just outside the gate, with a face as radiant as her own. I was coming, he said, after the first rapture had somewhat subsided, to tell Aunt Hitty. I told her, returned the girl proudly, all by my own self. You don't mean it. What did she say? She said everything. She told me hell was yawning at my feet, but I'm sure it's heaven. She said that she was my father and mother rolled into one, and I was obliged to remind her that I was of age. You thought of that, she said admiringly. I didn't even know that I'd ever get old enough not to mind anybody but myself, or you. You won't have to mind me, laughed Ralph. I'll give you a long rope. What would I do with a rope? Queried Araminta seriously. You funny, funny girl. Didn't you ever see a cow staked out in the pasture? Yes. Am I a cow?
For the purposes of illustration, yes. And Aunt Hitty represents the stake. For 18 or 19 years your rope has been so short that you could hardly move at all. Now things are changed, and I represent the stake. You've got the longest rope now that was ever made in one piece. See?
I'll come back, answered Araminta seriously. I don't think I need any rope at all.
No, dear, I know that. I was only joking. You poor child, you lived so long with that old dragon that you scarcely recognize a joke when you see one. A sense of humor, Araminta, is a saving grace for anybody. Next to love, it's the finest gift of the gods.
Have I got it?
I guess so. I think it's asleep, but we'll wake it up. Look here, dear, see what I brought you.
From his pocket, Ralph took a small purple velvet case lined with white satin. Within was a ring set with a diamond, small in circumference but deep and of unusual brilliancy. By a singular coincidence, it fitted Araminta's third finger exactly. "Oh!" she cried, her cheeks glowing. "For me?"
"Yes, for you, till I get you another one. This was my mother's ring, sweetheart. I found it among my father's things. Will you wear it, for her sake and for mine?"
"I'll wear it always," answered Araminta, her great gray eyes on his. "And I don't want any other ring. Why, if it hadn't been for her, I never could have had you." Ralph took her into his arms. His heart was filled with that supreme love which has no need of words. Meanwhile, Miss Mehitable was having her bad quarter of an hour. Manlike, Thorpe had taken himself away from a spot where he felt there was about to be a display of emotion. She was in the house alone, and the acute stillness of it seemed an accurate foreshadowing of the future. Miss Mehitable was not among those rare souls who are seldom lonely. Her nature demanded continuous conversation, the subject alone being unimportant. Every thought that came into her mind was destined for a normal outlet in speech. She had no mental reservoir. Araminta was going away, to be married. In spite of her trouble, Miss Mehitable noted the taint of heredity. "It's in her blood," she murmured, "and maybe Minty ain't so much to blame." In this crisis, however, Miss Mehitable had the valiant support of her conscience. She had never allowed the child to play with boys. In fact, she had not had any playmates at all. As soon as Araminta was old enough to understand, she was taught that boys and men, indeed all human things that wore trousers, long or short, were rank poison, and were to be steadfastly avoided if a woman desired peace of mind. Miss Mehitable frequently said that she had everything a husband could have given her except a lot of trouble. Daily, almost hourly, the wisdom of single blessedness had been impressed upon Araminta. Miss Mehitable neglected no illustration calculated to bring the lesson home. She had even taught her that her own mother was an outcast, and had brought disgrace upon her family by marrying. She held aloft her maiden standard, and literally compelled Araminta to enlist. Now all her work had gone for naught. Nature had triumphantly reasserted itself, and Araminta had fallen in love. The years stretched before Miss Mehitable in a vast and gloomy vista, illuminated by no light. No soft step upon the stair, no sunny face at her table, no sweet girlish laugh, no long companionable afternoons with patchwork, while she talked and Araminta listened. At the thought her stern mouth quivered ever so slightly, and all at once she found the relief of tears. An hour or so afterwards she went up to the attic, walking with a stealthy, cat-like tread, though there was no one in the house to hear. In a corner, far back under the eaves, 3 trunks were piled, one on top of the other. Miss Hitty lifted off the top 2 trunks without apparent effort, for her arms were strong, and drew the lowest one out into the path of sunlight that lay upon the floor, maple branches swaying across it in silhouette. In another corner of the attic, up among the rafters, was a box apparently filled with old newspapers. Miss Hitty reached down among the newspapers with accustomed fingers, and drew out a crumpled wad tightly wedged into one corner of the box. She listened carefully at the door, but there was no step in the house. She was absolutely alone. Nonetheless, she bolted the door of the attic before she picked the crumpled paper apart and took out the key of the trunk. The old lock opened readily, and from the trunk came the musty odor of long-dead lavender and rosemary, lemon verbena, and rose geranium. On top was Barbara Lee's wedding gown. Miss Hitty always handled it with reverence not unmixed with awe, never having had a wedding gown herself. Underneath were the baby clothes which the girl wife had begun to make when she first knew of her child's coming. The cloth was none too fine, and the little garments were awkwardly cut and badly sewn, but every stitch had been guided by a great love. Araminta's first shoes were there, too, soft, formless things of discolored white kid. Folded in a yellowed paper was a tiny golden curl, snipped secretly and marked on the outside, Minty's hair. Farther down in the trunk were the few relics of Miss Mehitable's far-away girlhood. A dog-eared primer, a string of bright buttons, a broken slate, a ragged, disreputable doll, and a few blown birds' eggs carefully packed away in a small box of cotton. These were her treasures. There was an old autograph album with a gay blue cover which the years in the trunk had not served to fade. Far down in the trunk was a package which Miss Mehitable took out reverently. It was large and flat, and tied with heavy string in hard knots. She untied the knots patiently. Her mother had taught her never to cut a string. Underneath was more paper and more string. It took her half an hour to bring to light the inmost contents of the package, bound in layer after layer of fine muslin, but not tied. She unrolled the yellowed cloth carefully, for it was very frail. At last she took out a photograph, Anthony Dexter at 23, and gazed at it long. On one page of her autograph album was written an old rhyme. The ink had faded so that it was scarcely legible, but Miss Hitty knew it by heart.
If you love me as I love you, no knife can cut our love in two. Your sincere friend, Anthony Dexter.
Like a tiny sprig of lavender taken from a bush which has never bloomed, this bit of romance lay far back in the secret places of her life. She had a knot of blue ribbon which Anthony Dexter had once given her, a lead pencil which he had gallantly sharpened, and which she had never used. Her life had been barren. Miss Mehitable knew that, and in her hours of self-analysis admitted it. She would gladly have taken Evelina's full measure of suffering in exchange for 1/10 of Araminta's joy. After Anthony Dexter had turned from her to Evelina, Miss Mehitable had openly scorned him. She had spent the rest of her life since in showing him and the rest that men were nothing to her and that he was least of all. She had hovered near his patients simply for the sake of seeing him. She did not care for them at all. She sat in the front window that she might see him drive by, and counted that day lost which brought her no sign of him. This was her one tenderness, her one vulnerable point. The afternoon shadows grew long, and the maple branches ceased to sway. Outside, a bird crooned a lullaby to his nesting mate. An oriole perched on the topmost twig of an evergreen in a corner of the yard, and opened his golden throat in a rapture of song. Love was abroad in the world that day. Bees hummed it, birds sang it, roses breathed it. The black and gold messengers of the field bore velvety pollen from flower to flower, moving lazily on shimmering gossamer wings. A meadowlark rose from a distant clover field, dropping exquisite silvery notes as he flew. The scent of green fields and honeysuckles came in at the open window, mingled inextricably with the croon of the bees. But Miss Mehitable knew only that it was summer, that the world was young, but she was old and alone, and would be alone for the rest of her life. She leaned forward to look at the picture, and Anthony Dexter smiled back at her, boyish, frank, eager, lovable. A tear dropped on the pictured face. not the first one, for the photograph was blistered oddly here and there. "I done all I could," said Miss Mehitable to herself, as she wrapped it up again in its many yellowed folds of muslin. "I thought Minty would be happier so, but maybe after all God knows best." End of chapter 24. Telling Aunt Hitty. Chapter 25 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Bellwest. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 25. Redeemed. Miss Evelina sat alone in her house, at peace with Anthony Dexter and with all the world. The surging flood of forgiveness and compassion which had swept over her as she gazed at his dead face had broken down all barriers, abrogated all reserves. She saw that Piper Tom was right. Had she forgiven him, she would have been free long ago. She shrank no longer from her kind, but yearned instead for friendly companionship. Once she had taken off her veil and started down the road to Miss Mehitable's, but the habit of the years was strong upon her, and she turned back, affrighted, when she came within sight of the house. Since she left the hospital, no human being had seen her face, save Anthony Dexter and his son. She had crept nun-like into the shelter of her chiffon, dimly taking note of a world which could not in turn look upon her. She clung to it still, yet perceived that it was a lie. She studied herself in the mirror, no longer hating the sight of her own face. She was not now blind to her own beauty, nor did she fail to see that transfiguring touch of sorrow and peace. These two are sculptors, one working both from within and without, and the other only from within. Why should she not put her veil forever away from her now? Why should she not meet the world face to face, as frankly as the world met her? Why should she delay? She had questioned herself continually, but found no answer. Since she came back to her old home, she had been mysteriously led. Perhaps she was to be led further through the deep mazes of life. It was not only possible, but probable. "I'll wait," she said to herself, "for a sign." She had not seen the Piper since the day they met so strangely, with Anthony Dexter lying dead between them. Quite often, however, she had heard the flute, usually at sunrise or sunset, afar off in the hills. Once, at the hour of the turning night, the melody had come to her on the first gray winds of dawn. A robin had waked to answer it, for the Piper's fluting was wondrously like his own voice. Contrasting her present peace with her days of torment, Miss Evelina thrilled with gratitude to Piper Tom, who had taken the weeds out of her garden in more senses than one. His hand had guided her, slowly yet surely, to the heights of calm. She saw her life now as a desolate valley lying between two peaks. One was sunlit, yet opaline with the mists of morning. The other was scarcely a peak, but merely a high and grassy plain upon which the afternoon shadows lay long. Oh, but there were terrors in the dark valley which lay between, sharp crags and treeless wastes, tortuous paths and abysmal depths, with never a rest for the wayfarer who struggled blindly on. She was not yet so secure upon the height that she could contemplate the valley unmoved, and was kept so by her own hands. At first she had not cared, and the dust and the cobwebs had not mattered at all. Miss Mehitable in the beginning had inspired her to housewifely effort, and Dr. Ralph's personal neatness had made her ashamed. She worked in the garden, too, keeping the brick-bordered paths free from weeds, and faithfully attending to every plant. Yet life seemed strangely empty, lifted above its all-embracing pain. The house and garden did not occupy her fully, and she had few books. These were all old ones, and she knew them by heart, though she had found some pleasure in reading again the well-thumbed fairy books of her childhood. She had read the book which Ralph had brought Araminta, and thought of asking him to lend her more, if she ever saw him again. She knew that he was very busy, but she felt that surely he would come again before long. Araminta danced up the path, singing, and rapped at Miss Evelina's door. When she came in, it was like a ray of sunlight in a gloomy place. "Miss Evelina!" she cried. "Oh, Miss Evelina, I'm going to be married!" "I'm glad," said Evelina tenderly, yet with a certain wistfulness. Once the joy of it had been in her feet, too, and the dread valley of desolation had opened up before her. "See!" cried Araminta, extending a dimpled hand. "See my ring! It's my engagement ring," she added proudly. Miss Evelina winced a little behind her veil, for the ring was the one Anthony Dexter had given her soon after their betrothal. Fearing gossip, she had refused to wear it until after they were married. So he had taken it to have it engraved, but evidently the engraving had never been done. Otherwise Ralph would not have given it to Araminta, she was sure of that. "It was his mother's ring, Miss Evelina, and now it's mine. His father loved his mother just as Ralph loves me. It's so funny not to have to say Dr. Ralph. Oh, I am so glad I broke my ankle. He's coming, but I wanted to come first by myself. I made him wait for 5 minutes down under the elm because I wanted to tell you first. I told Aunt Hitty all alone, and I wasn't a bit afraid. Oh, Miss Evelina, I wished you had somebody to love you as he loves me." "So do I," murmured Evelina, grateful for the chiffon that hid her tears. "Wasn't there ever anybody?" "Yes." "I knew it. You're so sweet, nobody could help loving you. Did he die?" "Yes." "It was that way with Mr. Thorpe," mused Araminta reminiscently. "They loved each other and were going to be married, but she died. He said, though, that death didn't make any difference with loving. There's Ralph now."
"Little witch,"
said the boy fondly, as she met him at the door,
"did you think I could wait a whole 5 minutes?"
They sat in the parlor for half an hour or more, and during this time it was not necessary for their hostess to say a single word. They were quite unaware that they were not properly conducting a 3-sided conversation, and Miss Evelina made no effort to enlighten them. Youth and laughter and love had not been in her house before for a quarter of a century. "Come again," she begged when they started home. Joy incarnate was a welcome guest. It did not mock her now. Halfway down the path, Ralph turned back to the veiled woman who stood wistfully in the doorway. Araminta was swinging in a childish fashion upon the gate. Ralph took Miss Evelina's hand in his.
"I wish I could say all I feel," he began awkwardly, "but I can't. With all my heart, I wish I could give some of my happiness to you."
"I am content, since I have forgiven."
"If you had not, I could never have been happy again, and even now I still feel the shame of it. Are you going to wear that veil always?"
"No," she whispered, shrinking back into the shelter of it, "but I'm waiting for a sign."
"May it soon come,"
said Ralph earnestly. "I'm used to waiting. My life has been made up of waiting. God bless you," she concluded impulsively.
"And you,"
he answered, touching his lips to her hand. He started away, but she held him back. "Ralph," she said passionately, "be true to her. Be good to her, and never let her doubt you. Teach her to trust you, and make yourself worthy of her trust. Never break a promise made to her, though it cost you everything else you have in the world. I am old, and I know that at the end nothing counts for an instant besides the love of two. Remember that keeping faith with her is keeping faith with God."
"I will,"
returned Ralph, his voice low and uneven.
"It is what my own mother would have said to me had she been alive today. I thank you."
The house was very lonely after they had gone, though the echoes of love and laughter seemed to have come back to a place where they once held full sway. The afternoon wore to its longest shadows, and the dense shade of the cypress was thrown upon the garden. Evelina smiled to herself, for it was only a shadow. The mignonette breathed fragrance into the dusk. Scent of lavender and rosemary filled the stillness with balm. Drowsy birds chirped sleepily in their swaying nests, and the fairy folk of field and meadow set up a whir of melodious wings. White, ghostly moths fluttered cloud-like over the quiet garden, and here and there a tiny lamp-bearer stirred the night. A flaming meteor sped across the uncharted dark of the heavens, where only the love-star shone. The moon had not yet risen. From within, Evelina recognized the sturdy figure of Piper Tom, and went out to meet him as he approached. She had drawn down her veil, but her heart was strangely glad. "Shall we sit in the garden?" she asked.
"Ay, in the garden," answered the piper, "since 'tis for the last time."
His voice was sad, and Evelina yearned to help him, even as he had helped her. "What is it?" she asked. "Is it anything you can tell me?"
"Only that I'll be trudging on tomorrow. My work here is done. I can do no more."
"Then let me tell you how grateful I am for all you have done for me. You made me see things in their true relation and taught me how to forgive. I was in bondage, and you made me free." The piper sprang to his feet.
"Spinner in the sun," he cried, "is it true? Just as I thought your night was endless, has the light come? Tell me again," he pleaded. "Oh, tell me 'tis true."
"It is true," said Evelina with solemn joy. "In all my heart there is nothing but forgiveness. The anger and resentment are gone, all gone."
"Spinner in the sun,"
breathed the piper, scarcely conscious that he spoke the words aloud.
"My spinner in the sun."
Slowly the moon climbed toward the zenith, and still, because there was no need, they spoke no word. Dew rose whitely from the clover fields beyond, veiling them as with white chiffon. It was the piper at last who broke the silence.
"When I trudge on tomorrow," he said, "'twill be with a glad heart, even though the little chap is no longer with me. 'Tis a fair, brave world, I'm thinking, since I've set your threads to going right again. I called you," he added softly, "and you came."
"Yes," said Evelina happily. "You called me, and I came."
"Spinner in the sun," said the piper tenderly, "have you guessed my work?"
"Why, keeping the shop, isn't it?" asked Evelina wonderingly. "The needles and thread and pins and buttons and all the little trifles that women need, a peddler's pack set up in a house."
The piper laughed. "No," he replied, "I'm thinking that is not my work, nor yet the music that has no tune, which I'm forever playing on my flute. Lady, I have travelled far, and seen much, and always there has been one thing that is strangest of all. In every place that I have been in yet, there has been a church, and a minister, whose business was to watch over human souls. He's told them what was right according to his own thinking, which I'm far from saying isn't true for him, and never minded anything more. In spite of blood and tears and agony, he's always held up the one standard, and, I'm thinking, has always pointed to the hardest way to reach it. The way has been so hard that many never reach it at all, and those who have, I'm not seeing that they are the happiest or the kindest, nor that they are loved the most. In the same place, too, there is always a doctor whose business it is to watch over the body. If you have a broken leg or a broken arm or a fever, he can set you right again. Blind eyes can be made to see, and deaf ears made to hear, but, lady, who is there to care about the broken heart? I have taken in my peddler's pack the things that women need, because 'tis women, mostly, who bear the heartaches of the world, and I come closer to them so. What you say I've done for you, I've done for many more. I'm trying to make the world a bit easier for all women, because a woman gave me life, and because I love another woman in another way," he added, his voice breaking. "I'll be trudging on tomorrow alone, though 'twould be easier, I'm thinking, to linger here."
Evelina's heart leaped with a throb of the old pain. "Tell me about her," she said, because it seemed the only thing to say.
"The woman I love," answered the piper, "is not for me. She'd never be thinking to stoop in to such as I, and I'd not be insulting her by asking. She's very proud, but she could be tender if she chose, and she's the bravest soul I ever knew. So brave that she fears neither death nor life, though life itself has not been kind. Her little feet have been set upon the rough pathways almost since the beginning, and her hands catch at my heartstrings. They're so frail. They're fluttering always like frightened birds, and the fluttering is in her voice, too.
And her face?
Oh, but I dreamed of her face. I thought it was noble beyond all words, with eyes like the first deep violets of spring, but filled with compassion for all the world. So brave, so true, so tender, it might be that I'm thinking that if I could see it once, with love on it for me, that I'd never be asking for more.
Why haven't you seen her face? Asked Evelina idly, to relieve an awkward pause. Is she only a dream woman?
Nay, she's not a dream woman. She lives and breathes as dreams never do, but she hides her face because she is so beautiful. She veils her face from me, as once she veiled her soul.
Then at last Evelina understood. She felt the hot blood mantling her face, and was thankful once more for the shelter of her chiffon.
"Spinner in the sun," said the piper with suppressed tenderness. "Were you thinking I could see you more than once or twice and not be caring? Were you thinking I could have the inmost soul of me torn because you'd been hurt and never be knowing what lay beyond it for me? Were you thinking I could be talking to you day after day without having the longing to talk with you always? And now that I've done my best for you and given you all that rests with me for giving, do you see why I'll be trudging on tomorrow, alone? 'Tis not for me to be asking it, for God knows I could never be worthy, but I've thought of heaven as a place where you and I might fare together always, with me to heal your wounds, help you over the rough places, and guide you through the dark. That part of it I'm to have, I'm thinking, for God has been very good to me. I'm to know that wherever you are, you're happy at last, because it's been given to me to lead you into the light. I called you, and you came."
"Yes," said Evelina, her voice lingering upon the words. "You called me, and I came, and was redeemed. Tell me, in your thought of heaven, have you ever asked to see my face?"
"Nay," cried the piper. "Do you think I'd be asking for what you hide from me? I know that 'tis because you're so beautiful, and such beauty is not for my eyes to see."
"Piper Tom," she answered. "Dear Piper Tom, I told you once that I had been terribly burned. I was hurt so badly that when the man I was pledged to marry, and whose life I had saved, was told that every feature of mine was destroyed except my sight, he went away and never came back any more."
"The brute to hurt laddie," he said in a low tone. "I told him that a man who would torture a dog would torture a woman too. I'd not be minding the scars," he added, "since they're brave scars and not the marks of sin or shame. I'm thinking that 'tis the brave scars that have made you so beautiful. So beautiful," he repeated, "that you hide your face."
Into Evelina's heart came something new and sweet. That perfect, absolute, unwavering trust which a woman has but once in her life, and of which Anthony Dexter had never given her the faintest hint. All at once she knew that she could not let him go, that he must either stay or take her too. She leaned forward. "Piper Tom," she said, unashamed, "when you go, will you take me with you? I think we belong together, you and I."
"Belong together?" he repeated incredulously. "Ah, 'tis your pleasure to mock me. Oh, my spinner in the sun, why would you wish to hurt me so?"
Tears blinded Evelina so that through her veil and in the night she could not see at all. When the mists cleared, he was gone. End of chapter 25. Redeemed.
Chapter 26 of A Spinner in the Sun. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukolo. A Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 26. From afar, at the turn of night, came the pipes o' Pan, the wild, mysterious strain which had first summoned Evelina from pain to peace. At the sound she sat up in her bed, her heavy, lustreless white hair falling about her shoulders. She guessed that Piper Tom was out upon the highway, with his peddler's pack strapped to his sturdy back. As in a vision, she saw him marching onward from place to place, to make the world easier for all women because a woman had given him life, and because he loved another woman in another way. Was it always to be so? She wondered. Should she forever thirst while others drank? While others loved, must she eternally stand aside heart-hungry? Unyielding fate confronted her, veiled inscrutably, but she guessed that the veil concealed a mocking smile. Out of her Nessus robe of agony, Evelina had emerged with one truth. Whatever is may not be right, but it is the outcome of deep and far-reaching forces with which our finite hands may not meddle. The problem has but one solution: adjustment. Hedged in by the iron bars of circumstance, as surely as a bird within his cage, it remains for the individual to choose whether he will beat his wings against the bars until he dies, or take his place serenely on the perch ordained for him, and sing. Within his cage the bird may do as he likes. He may sleep or eat or bathe, or whet his beak uselessly against the cuttlebone thrust between the bars. He may hop about endlessly and chirp salutations to other birds, likewise caged, or he may try his eager wings in a flight which is little better than no flight at all. His cage may be a large one, yet if he explores far enough, he will most surely bruise his body against the bars of circumstance. With beak and claws and constant toil he may, perhaps, force an opening in the bars wide enough to get through slowly and with great discomfort. He has gained, however, only a larger cage. If he is a wise bird, he settles down and tries to become satisfied with his surroundings, even to gather pleasure from the gilt wires and the cuttlebone thrust picturesquely between them. When the sea-gull wings his majestic way past his habitation, free as the wind itself, the wise bird will close his eyes and affect not to see. So also will the gull, for there is no loneliness comparable with unlimited freedom. Upon the heights the great ones stand alone. To the dweller in the valley, those distant peaks are clad in more than mortal splendor. Time and distance veil the jagged cliffs and hide the precipices. Day comes first to the peaks and lingers there longest. While it is night in the valley, there is still afterglow upon the hills. Perhaps some dweller in the valley longs for the height and sets forth, heeding not the eager hands that, selfishly as it seems, would keep him within their loving reach. Having once turned his face upward, he does not falter, even for the space of a backward look. He finds that the way is steep, that there is no place to rest, and that the comfort and shelter of the valley are unknown. The sun burns him, and the cold freezes his very blood, for there are only extremes on the way to the peak. Glittering wastes of ice dazzle him, and snow blinds him with terror and not with beauty as from below. The opaline mists are gone, and he sees with dreadful clearness the path which lies immediately ahead. Beyond there is emptiness, vast as the desert. At the timber line he pauses, and for the first time looks back. Ah, how fair the valley lies below him! The silvery ribbon of the river winds through a pageantry of green and gold. Upon the banks are woodland nooks, fragrant with growing things, and filled with a tender quiet broken only by the murmur of the stream. The turf is soft and cool to the wayfarer's tired feet, and there is crystal water in abundance to quench his thirst. But from the peak no traveler returns, for the way is hopelessly cut off. Above the timberline there is only a waste of rock, worn by vast centuries, in which every day is an ordinary lifetime, into small, jagged stones that cut the feet. The crags are thunder-swept and blown by cataclysmic storms, of which the dwellers in the valley have never dreamed. In the unspeakable loneliness, the pilgrim abides forever with his mocking wreath of laurel, cheered only by a rumbling, reverberant "All hail!" which comes at age-long intervals from some peak before whose infinite distance his finite sight fails. At intervals throughout the day, Miss Evelina heard the piper's flute, always from the hills. Each time it brought her comfort, for she knew that, as yet, he had not gone. Once she fancied that he had gone long ago, and some woodland deity, magically transported from ancient Greece, had taken his place. Late in the afternoon, she heard it once, but so far and faintly that she guessed it was for the last time. In her garden there were flowers blooming luxuriantly. From their swaying censers fragrant incense filled the air. The weeds had been taken out and no trace was left. From the garden of her heart the weeds were gone too, but there were no flowers. Rue and asphodel had been replaced by lavender and rosemary. The deadly black poppy had been uprooted, and where it had grown there were spikenard and balm. Yet, as the piper had said, she asked for roses, and it is not every garden which roses will bloom. At dusk she went out into her transformed garden. Where once the thorns had held her back, the paths were straight and smooth. Dense undergrowth and clinging vines no longer made her steps difficult. Piper Tom had made her garden right, and opened before her clearly the way of her soul. In spite of the beauty there was desolation, because the cheery presence had gone to return no more. Her loneliness was so acute that it was almost pain, and yet the pain was bearable, because he had taught her how to endure and to look beyond. Fairy-like, the white moss fluttered through the garden, and the crickets piped cheerily. Miss Evelina stopped her ears that she might not hear their piping, rude reminder, as it was, of music that should come no more, but even so, she could not shut out remembrance. With a flash of her old resentment, she recalled how everything upon which she had ever depended had been taken away from her, almost immediately. No sooner had she learned the sweetness of clinging than she had been forced to stand alone. One by one the supports had been removed, until she stood alone, desolate and wretched, indeed, but alone. Of such things as these self-reliance is made. Suddenly the still air seemed to stir. A sound that was neither breath nor music, so softly was it blown, echoed in from the hills. Then came another and another, merest hints of melody, till at last she started up, trembling. Surely these distant flutings were the pipes au pain! She set herself to listen. Her tiny hands worked convulsively. Nearer and nearer the music came, singing of wind and stream and mountain, the music that had no tune. No sooner had it become clear than it ceased altogether. But an hour or so afterward, when the moon had risen, there was a familiar step upon the road outside. Veiled, Evelina went to the gate and met Piper Tom, whose red feather was aloft in his hat again, and whose flute was slung over his shoulder by its accustomed cord. His peddler's pack was not to be seen. "I thought you had gone," she said. "I had," he answered. "But it is not written, I'm thinking, that a man may not change his mind as well as a woman. My heart would not let my feet go away from you until I knew for sure whether or not you were mocking me last night." "Mocking you? No! Surely you know I would never do that." "No, I did not know. The ways of women are strange, I'm thinking, past all finding out. In truth, it would be stranger if you were not mocking me than it ever could be if you were. Tell me," he pleaded, Ah, tell me what you are meaning, in words so plain that I can understand." "Come," said Evelina, "come to where we were sitting last night, and I will tell you." He followed her back to the maple beside the broken wall, where the two chairs still faced each other. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at her so keenly that she felt, in spite of the darkness and her veil, that he must see her face. "Piper Tom," she said, "when you came to me, I was the most miserable woman on earth. I had been most cruelly betrayed, and sorrow seized upon me when I was not strong enough to stand it. It preyed upon me until it became an obsession. It possessed me absolutely, and from it there was no escape but death." "I know," answered the piper. "I found the bottle that had held the dreamless sleep. I'm thinking you had thrown it away." "Yes, I had thrown it away, but only because I was too proud to die at his door. Do you understand?" "Yes, I'm thinking I understand, but go on. You've not told me whether or no you mock me. What did you mean?" "I meant," said Evelina steadfastly, "that if you cared for the woman you had led out of the shadows of the cypress, and for all that was in her heart to give you, she was yours, not only out of gratitude, but because you have put trust into a heart that has known no trust since its betrayal, and because, where trust is, there may some day come more." Her voice sank almost to a whisper, but Piper Tom heard it. He took her hand in his own, and she felt him tremble. She was the strong one now. "Spinner in the sun," he began huskily, "were you meaning that you'd go with me when I took the highway again, and help me make the world easier for everybody with a hurt heart?" "Yes," she answered. "You called me, and I came, for always." "Were you meaning that you'd face the storms and the cold with me, and take no heed of the rain, that you'd live on the coarse fare I could pick up from day to day, and never mind it?" "Yes, I meant all that." "Were you meaning, perhaps, that you'd make a home for me? Oh, spinner in the sun, it takes a woman to make a home." "Yes, I'd make a home, or go gypsying with you, just as you chose." The piper laughed with inexpressible tenderness. "You know, I'm thinking that it would be a home and not gypsying, that I'd not let you face anything I could shield you from." Evelina laughed too, a slow, sweet laugh. "Yes, I know," she said. The piper turned away, struggling with temptation. At length he came back to her. "It is wrong of me, I'm thinking, but I take you as a man takes heaven, and we'll do the work together. It is as though I had risen from the dead, and the gates of pearl were open, with all the angels of God beckoning me in." In the exaltation that was upon him, he had no thought of profaning her by a touch. She stood apart from him as something high and holy, enthroned in a sacred place. "Beloved," he pleaded, "will you be coming with me now to the place where I saw you first? It is right now, and then 'twas day, but I'm thinking the words are wrong. It is day now, with the sun and moon and stars all shining at once, and suns that I never saw before. Will you come?" "I'll go wherever you lead me," she answered. "While you hold my hand in yours, I can never be afraid." They went through the night together, taking the shorter way over the hills. She stumbled, and he took her hand, his own still trembling. "Close your beautiful eyes," he whispered, "and trust me to lead you." Though she did not close her eyes, she gave herself wholly to his guidance, noting how he chose for himself the rougher places to give her the easier path. He pushed aside the undergrowth before her, lifted her gently over damp hollows, and led her around the stones. At last they came to the woods that opened out upon the river road, where she had stood the day before she had been splashed with mud from Anthony Dexter's wheels, and at the same instant had heard the mysterious flutings from afar. They entered near the hill to which her long wandering had led her, and at the foot of it the piper paused. "You'll have no fear, I'm thinking, since the moon makes the clearing as bright as day, and I'll not be letting you out of my sight. I have a fancy to stand upon yonder level place and call you as I called you once before. Only this time the heart of me will dance to my own music, for I know you'll be coming all the while I play." He left her and clambered up the hill to the narrow ledge which sloped back, and was surrounded with pines. He kept in the open spaces, so that the moonlight was always upon him, and she did not lose sight of him more than once or twice, and then only for a moment. The hill was not a high one, and the ascent was very gradual. Within a few minutes he had gained his place. Clear and sweet through the moonlit forest rang out the pipes of Pan, singing of love and joy. Never before had the piper's flute given forth such music as this. The melody was as instinctive as the mating call of a thrush, as crystalline as a mountain stream, and as pure as the snow from whence the stream had come. Evelina climbed to meet him, her face and heart uplifted. The silvery notes dropped about her like rain as she ascended, strangely glad and strangely at peace. When she reached the level place where he was standing, his face illumined with unspeakable joy. He dropped his flute and opened his arms. "My spinner in the sun," he whispered, "I called you, and you came." "Yes," she answered from his close embrace. "You called me, and I have come for always." At last he released her, and they stood facing each other. The piper was stirred to the depths of his soul. "Last night I dreamed," he said, "and it was the dream that brought me back. It was a little place, with a brook close by, and almost too small to be called a house, but 'twas a home, I'm thinking, because you were there. It was night, and I had come back from making the world a bit easier for some poor woman's soul, and you were standing in the door, waiting. The veil was gone, and there was love on your face. Ah, I've often dreamed a woman was waiting for me so, but because you hide your beauty from me, it is not for me to be asking more. God knows I have enough given me now. Since the first I've known you were beautiful and very brave. I knew, too, that you were sad, that you had been through sorrows no man would dare to face. I've dreamed your eyes were like the first violets of spring, your lips deep scarlet like the winter berries, and I know the wonder of your hair, for the veil does not hide it all. I've dreamed your face was cold and pure, as if made from marble, yet tender, too, and I well know that it's noble past all words of mine, because it bears brave scars. I've told you I would never ask, and I'll keep my word, for I know well it is not for the likes of me to see it, but only to dream. Don't think I'm asking, for I never will, but, spinner in the sun, because you said you would fare with me on the highway and face the cold and storm, it gives me courage to ask for this. If I close my eyes, will you lift your veil and let me kiss the brave scars that were never from sin or shame? The brave scars, beloved. Ah, if you would let me, only once, kiss the brave scars." Evelina laughed, a laugh that was half a sob, and leaning forward, full into the moonlight, she lifted her veil forever. End of chapter 26. Recording by Ginger Kukalo, Washington, D.C. End of Spinner in the Sun by Myrtle Reed.